The Secret Glory, Introduction to Chapters 5 and 6, by Arthur Machen. From many sources, both public and private, I have received criticisms, mild and not so mild, of the view taken in The Secret Glory of the great public schools. I have been accused of denigrating these famous institutions, of painting them, that is, of an almost and impossible blackness. My answer to all these accusations is a simple one. A few weeks after publication of The Secret Glory, I read a review of a book called Of Edmund Ware. Dr. Ware was a famous headmaster of Eton, and in the volume in question, the colleagues of the late head testified profusely as to his merits. Thus, I distinctly feared Ware's accession. I feared the dominance of athletics, his own autocratic ways, his strict adherence to the routine of what I thought a rather narrow and dry scholasticism. The change came, and never was a more delightful surprise. It was like a fresh wind from the sea blowing into the place. Another Eton master. I like to think that Ware regarded the school as a great army on the march, the pace of which must necessarily be kept uniform. The lower master. Ware's visits to schoolroom were tremendous. There is no other word for it. The door flew open, and in he swept. The boys sprang up with palpitating hearts, and the master looked suddenly bewildered. Yet there was nothing to fear. The awe was that naturally felt in the presence of majesty. Another master on Dr. Ware's boots. He mentions that the head was a man of ordinary middle height. They were not ungainly or policeman-like boots, but only the head could have wielded them, and wield is the only verb that fits the case. He seemed hardly mortal in his brogues. Lastly, a colleague who speaks of the head's vibrating voice. This vibration had an effect on one's spine, like that of a fiddle in the overture of Tristan. Now all this is nothing more or less than unseemly and idiotic drivel. I take it that there can be no dispute on that point. Their late chief, these masters say, was like a fresh sea breeze. He was also like the violins in the overture of Tristan. He was of ordinary height, but yet he seemed taller than the sons of men. His mere presence bewildered the master who served under him, and gave the boys palpitations of the heart. He thought that the boys must all leave their lessons at the same rate, as an army must march at the same pace. None but he could have wielded his boots. Does such stuff as this need any comment? Now, let us consider that the men who uttered these imbecilities were masters at Eton, that Eton has always been considered as the head and chief and pattern of all the other great public schools of England. If they do these things in the Green Tree, and what is likely to be the product of a system administered by such men as this? The Secret Glory has been criticized from another point of view. It contains not only the public school motive, but also the motive of Celtic sanctity, typified usually for us by the legend of the Holy Grail. And some of my friends have expressed the view that it was a pity to mingle the one with the other, to interrupt and confuse the story of beautiful and wonderful things with the consideration of ugly and squalid and detestable things. You were wrong, they have said, to break off the vision of the perpetual choir of Cor-arbennic by the horror of the school service at Lupton, Dr. Chesson preaching. As a Yorkshire friend of mine often says to me, I don't agree with you. In these days, at all events, if one is to obtain credence for the real, it is necessary first of all to posit the actual. Be certain that your feet are firmly planted on the earth before you lift up your head to the heavens. And furthermore, I am sure that what I have done in The Secret Glory corresponds in the main to the veritable order of the world. I myself have seen something of life, I mean of real life, and my experience teaches me that the veils of enigmas are drawn aside not so much by fairy shoes or in enchanted castles as in Pentonville and Lloyd Square. I knew that theosophy was all nonsense when I learnt that the Mahatmas dwelt in the hidden recesses of Tibet, where, by the way, they would not be tolerated for a moment. If Madame Blavatsky had placed her magi in the recesses of Canterbury, I believe I should have found something credible in the system. And now, finally, a curious point. In the introduction to another volume in this edition, I made some remarks on the strange temporary assent which one gives sometimes to the marvelous in fiction. If the author has lured us on cunningly, leading us, step by step, on ground which seems firm enough, into his cave of wonders, where the solid earth has changed into a magic vapor of illusion, then, when the last line of the tale is done, we wake with a start from our dream, realizing that all is false. Well, here is a strange case. In The Secret Glory, there is the incident of the wretched, exiled, homesick boy comforted marvelously in the midst of reeking, hideous Lupton, with a theoria, the actual sight and sense of the beloved mountain in his own land. Well, this is pure invention, without the shadow of foundation in fact or in legend. And yet I am quite convinced that such a thing has happened, somewhere, somewhen, to someone. Book 5, Chapter 1. About a year after the adventure with Nellie, Ambrose Merrick at last caught that train from Lupton to Birmingham. He had waited for many years. He had yearned and sickened for the sight of the old land of his fathers. He had not allowed the memory of Gwent to fail. And now, when the whistle sounded and the train began to move out of the station, he was astonished to find himself so little uplifted by the granting of his desires. He looked up with a kind of sober joy at the railway bridge, on which the poor little boy had stood so often for so many hours, straining his eyes towards the west. He remembered that one day when the earth burned as with fire, and his heart and soul and body were faint almost to death. He remembered how he had been refreshed by the vision of the mountain, by the wind that breathed new life into him. It was curious, he thought, how against his own desire and his own faith he had ceased to take daily account of such a merciful marvel as this, which should have been a perpetual talisman, a constant defense against all weariness and sickness and despair, an hourly reminder that the world was not given up entirely to the powers of darkness. He understood the difficulty of the great act of faith which must be renewed day by day, again and again, by a constant exercise of the will, or else the abyss, the fall into the black pit of nonsense and despair, which most people spoke of as the world, and not half a bad place either, if you take it the right way. It was so simple, the "not half a bad place" creed. One fell in with it so easily, without any conscious effort of acquiescence. One conformed even against one's own steadfast convictions, unless these were continually renewed and proclaimed. One knew better, perhaps. One had been vouchsafed sure proofs from within and from without. And yet it was so entirely natural to believe that man is sustained by loaves from the baker and meat from the butcher, and to take one's measures accordingly. As the train sped away to the west and the south, he resolved that this should be amended, that for the future he would daily remind himself that he was not fed by baker's bread and butcher's meat, but by miracles and wonders. But the past year had been given over to that process of dryness and fear which is called the purgative way. It is needful, but it lacks all refreshment and unction, speaking more of unworthiness and darkness than of light and compassions. He had come back to Lupton after that holiday with a certain mark of grimness about the mouth. He went down into the fire that it might cleanse him. He put away the thought of wonders and mysteries of which he was not worthy. As has been seen from some of his notes, he had already made himself acquainted with the species of voluntary stripping, the giving up of all the decorations and ornaments and vestures of the inner life. But the sense of his guilt and his offense now stripped him in spite of himself, and he became familiar with the dark clouds of desolation. He had professed the mysteries, and he feared lest they should be withdrawn from him forever. For the first time in his school days, he really and interiorly submitted himself to the disciplines of the place. Not that he thought it good or wise or suitable for anything but the production of boobyism, but he accepted it as an instrument of correction, and for a year he had endeavored to occupy himself as much as possible with the interests of Lupton, putting aside, as far as he could, his own life and his own hidden knowledge. But he felt, as the train rushed from Midlandia Maledicta to Midlandia Felix, that enough had been done in the path of penance. The book entitled Here Begin Terrors was closed for a season. It was time to open another volume. Here begin Great Wonders. He was nearly 19. In the autumn he would go up to Oxford for his scholarship examination, but he did not mean to go to the university, at all events for the present. He intended to submit himself to other schools and more remote ways of knowledge. He had made certain vows of reparation for the wrong he had done, and he began to have a glimmering vision of that which might prove to be the purpose and the end of his life. If this were to be so, if indeed he were called to so holy and mystical an office, to the celebration of such high and wonderful ceremonies, with what instant and especial care he must begin to prepare himself, how sternly he must shut out from his heart all the apparatus of vanity and lies. He feared lest he should have bowed down too low in the temple of the false deities, though the motive has been good, but he had tried to listen sympathetically to the doctor's sermons. And what a curse it had been during the last term! The main point enforced had been that one could not arrange one's life in separate compartments without relating the one to the other, that all life was of infinite and equal importance, that the games and work of school were to be regarded just as seriously as the pursuits and labors of later years. "Do not let us mistake," said the preacher one Sunday morning. "We are already inhabitants of eternity, here at Lupton in school and in the playing fields, in our sports and in our studies. Each action is of eternal import. Each action forms part of that character which will be our everlasting possession." And the whole gist of the series was that any boy who wished to be a plausible and successful humbug in afterlife had better set about his great task immediately. "Remember," said the doctor, "we are not in the Dark Ages now. None among us will ever be called upon to be the minister of a capricious and arbitrary sovereign. There is no one here whose gift of statesmanship will be exercised in concocting measures against the liberties of the people. There is no one whose military ability will be utilized in deeds of savage and remorseless oppression. We are not in the Dark Ages. There may be future prelates in your rank for all I know, but the prelate of today is successor in name only to the medieval hierophant. No, we are to serve a sovereign who wears no visible crown. Let us all remember once and for all that there is no more splendid service than that of the people, that if we win high place and high honors, these things are but held by us in trust for the benefit of our brothers and sisters, that work which is useless to the multitude is not work at all, or, at the best, is work which is not worth the doing. We talk of the Church as if the word were synonymous with the clergy. How foolish! How erroneous! The Church is merely the state in its ethical persona. It represents the state by morally energizing, endeavoring to touch the great heart of the people to higher issues and nobler aims. The Church, as the state, derives all its power, all its authority, from those whom it serves. Again I say, distrust, and distrust profoundly, all work, all service that cannot abide the great popular test which I have indicated. Distrust yourself if you are not doing the people's work. Reconsider your position. Come down from the heights and take your place with the striving multitude below. Remember once and for all that popularity, in its true sense, is a noble aim. Nay, it is the noblest of all aims. What wonder that the Jewish populace cried Hosanna! He had compassion on the multitude. The common people heard him gladly. Let these words dwell in the minds of all of us, more especially in the minds who are soon to take their share of the great work of the world. Let us all beware. We are not to work for cliques, for small and select aristocratic bodies, however exquisite their taste, however high their standards. We are to work for and speak to the multitude, the common people. We are to win popularity. Ambrose shuddered and laughed at the recollection of this discourse and others like it. It was clear that he had had enough of such follies, and it was time for him to leave behind Lupton and all its ways. Already it seemed to belong to things departed. He would return for a little while at the end of the holidays and go through such formalities as were necessary, but Lupton was over. Its foolish routine, its magazines of cant, its dull pedantries, its sense of being at the center of all things. It was all past and performed, and lay in his mind like the recollection of a tedious and unimportant play, that one has witnessed and would willingly forget. Behind him all this weariness, its dolours and its languors, its pain and longings. Behind him also the evil that he had done, which had so heavily and grievously weighed down his spirit. Before him was the land of desire, the end and the goal and the perfection. He was not 19, but already, it seemed, the call had come. He looked forward to his stay at the Warren as a time of refreshment and preparation for the work that he had to do. He was to revisit his old home. When his father had died, Mr. Horbury, who was the trustee, had bethought him of some distant cousins of the Merricks, people named Vaughan, whom, he thought, might be glad to take the old place during Ambrose's minority. Mr. Vaughan, a widower with one daughter, was delighted with the proposal. The rent was moderate, the air was good, and he had pleasant recollections of the Warren dating from a visit paid long before. It was an admirable arrangement for both sides. The rent was secure, and Mr. Horbury, who liked managing, and always managed well, felt that Ambrose was lucky to be in such good hands. Indeed, he was quite right. He invested Mr. Merrick's capital in some excellent securities, and when Ambrose came of age, he found himself not only the owner of the pleasant and beloved old house, but also the possessor of a very pretty balance at the bank, the accumulation of 10 or 11 years, after due deduction of his school fees, board, and general expenses. It has been hinted that there were defects in Mr. Horbury's character, but there was never better or more scrupulous man of affairs. Mr. Vaughan, the cousin, was an odd and retired character. One of the reasons which made him welcome the chance of taking the Warren was the fact of its remoteness from a railway station. He hated trains, and never wanted to take them, spending his time in a little shooting, a good deal of fishing, and the writing of an interminable romance, which had kept him quiet for 25 years. Nothing much was known of it, save that the author was always consulting Ducange's lexicon of late Latinity. This did not seem very promising, and the ingenious author had neither the energy nor the guile of a brother of the craft, whose autumn paragraphs about the magnum opus in preparation appeared as regularly as the blackberries. Perhaps it would have been kinder if Mr. Vaughan had asked his cousin to spend the holidays at the Warren before, but the idea had not occurred to him. He supposed that Horbury was looking after the lad all right. At last, however, it had struck him that an invitation would be graceful, and perhaps at 19 Ambrose would no longer be a loud boy. Mr. Vaughan hated loud boys, and thought they spoilt life. He understood that they had to be fed on underdone mutton and rice puddings. They were always shouting. They never ceased from shouting from 5 o'clock in the morning till 11 o'clock at night, he persisted, and continually rushing about in staring white flannels. Nonsense, he would say. I know them. They do shout, and they never stop. I'd much rather live next to the kennels than next to a school. And what the devil do they mean by dressing in that absurd style? It's glaring. It's offensive. It's excessively silly. And why do they rush? What's the good of it? What do they get by it? I've noticed them. They can't walk like sensible people. They're always rushing, and it's most tiresome to look at. Moreover, they never, by any chance, know any single thing that can be of the faintest interest to any rational being. I have a black pig that could talk down a schoolboy any day. His name is Walter Map, and he is extremely intelligent. I value his companionship. He often goes out for walks with me. I would not take a loud boy out for a walk on any terms or conditions or considerations whatsoever. He would dress in white flannel, he would put a hideous stripy jacket on top, he would shout and rush all the way, he would high jump all the stiles, and a long jump all the brooks. He would stop now and then, and go through a most ridiculous pantomime with his walking stick, and roar out some rubbish about that being the way to meet Bogler's bowling. He would not utter one word of the remotest approach to the distant boundaries of sense. If I walked him to the top of Bonai Brechaniok and back again, damn the loud boy, and damn his masters for encouraging him to make such a fool of himself. Walter Map, now. Perhaps these sentiments had weighed largely in the forgetfulness of Mr. Vaughan towards his cousin. Even now he had had tremors, especially after reading Mr. Horbury's last letter, in which Ambrose had been highly commended, not only for his brilliant scholarship, but more especially for his proficiency in games. I have great hopes, wrote Mr. Horbury, that he will make a big name for himself and do the old school credit. He will have a nice little income at his back when he comes of age, so he will be able to pick and choose his own career. So many of us have to take what we can get, and sometimes that means that our real abilities run to seed for lack of opportunity. Ambrose will be differently placed. He can afford to wait and look about him. He is a really fine scholar, and besides the ordinary schoolwork, I fancy that he has read a good deal on his own account. I don't see how he can miss his first, even if he tries. But what is more important than mere scholarship, he is good at all our games, and his fast bowling will, I expect, do even more than his Greek verse to place him, first at the university, and then in the world. It may seem illogical enough, but as a matter of fact, athletics will carry a man farther than any amount of scholarship, and it is in this account that I feel so confident of Ambrose's future. The letter had filled Mr. Vaughan's mind with the most dismal apprehensions. He sincerely regretted the invitation. He meditated a diplomatic indisposition, but concluded that it would be better to suffer the young man for a time. If necessary, he could have all his meals sent into the study on the plea of writing a book. He would not, on any pretext, allow Ambrose to practice bowling on the lawn. That was settled, and Sylvia might hint that her father found shouting disturbed him when he was writing. But Mr. Vaughan looked pensive after sending that letter, and he was quite uneasy at breakfast on the day of Ambrose's expected arrival. Ambrose had written that he was not quite certain of his train. He would walk from the station, so there was no necessity to send anyone to meet him. He would carry a handbag, and his luggage could be fetched the next day. He wished to re-enter his native land alone, as lovers desire but each other when they are reunited after long years of absence. By the time that the train reached Hereford, Lupton had vanished from his mind and all recollections of it. He had been exiled, and he was returning, and when the great hills rose up before him, a strange emotion beat within his breast. He did not know the precise boundary of the counties, but at the sign of the hills he took off his hat, worshipping the dear soil of Gwent. The land had an unutterable word for him, and all his being made answer. The earth kept that day a quiet festival. He could almost have said, Montes exulteraverunt ut ariets, et colles sicut agni ovium. It was a day of soft sunshine behind a delicate veil. The land was all in a golden, wonderful radiance, and the clear streams glittered in the light, and the leaves of the trees danced with exultation in a wind blowing from the west. He looked out of the carriage window with a gaze of such ardor and delight as lovers know. Qui convertit petram in stagna aquarum, et rupem in fontes aquarum. His sojourn in the dry and stony land was ended. There rushed the translucent brook down from the mountainside, from the very heart of the rock. He fancied that he could hear the sound of the pouring waters and their voice of gladness. There was the glen which led to the wild country, the land of green bubbling wells, and the far purple fields of heather, and the world of the golden scented gorse, where the great rocks looked like magic druid rings. He and his father had climbed by that little path so many years ago to see a church of very old religion, and the well of an old saint. The brook rushed on. The line ran parallel with it for some miles. He feasted his eyes on that wonderful clear stream. He had seen no such sight since the day on which he had left Gwent, for about Lupton most of the rivers and brooks were poisonous sewers, and even the unpolluted waters were dull and muddy and sluggish, as they crawled through dull fields. Here was quick crystal, which sang letare as it passed from the hill into the valley. Its pools were a shining darkness. Its ripples were of silver light. It was pure as the dawn upon the mountains. It was as if the great alchemy of God had transmuted the hard innermost rocks with all their secrets into that rejoicing brightness, signifying how before the day of ruin all the world was a plastic light, an ever-changing mirror. On his left hand was now the hill of the apparition of St. Michael the Archangel, a strange riven height venerated by the people before the coming of the Black Hag of Geneva, who sends body and soul quick to hell. Here, they said, in the old days, those who knew would sometimes go apart, climbing the red height till they came to the chapel of the Archangel, a very small and ancient place, of which the foundations still remained, standing in a thick wood of ash trees. This observance, it has been said, furnishes the explanation of the curious poem by Morvran, called The Sovereignty of the Ash. Ambrose, as he gazed up towards the mountain, could see the wood, the boughs of the ash trees tossing in the wind, and he remembered the poem, a strange piece of metrical ingenuity in the original, which had served as a model to many generations of bards, though none had ever equaled it in the complexity of its structure. In its lines, Morvran had mingled alliteration and rhyme and assonance in a wonderful manner, and as the poets said, besides all this, there were inspiration and unction of such a singular magic that it was sometimes spoken of as the supreme incantation of Morvran. The poem represents all the trees as contending for the honor of sovereignty. As the first hues of the dawn above the forest of Cor-arbennic, there appeared a red blossom out of the shadow of the trees. The rose spoke. It was like the clear chant of the angels. Though I am least of the trees of the wood, though I am hidden and overshadowed in the wood, though I dwell often in obscurity, yet I claim principality in this assemblage, because I alone am a native of the old garden, because I typify the accomplishment of the saints, because in my blossom is hidden the great mystery, because I waft abroad sweet odors of paradise, ancient relics of the lost kingdom. The hazel boasts that its boughs are the choir of the birds of God, the wych elm of its use in magic. The oak has borne sway from all ages. The whitethorn is the shining house of Merlin. The yew has an honorable station near the altars of the saints. and so the poem ranges through all the trees of the wood till the ash triumphs. Because I keep watch over the shrine of the chief angel, because beneath my boughs shone the majesty of heaven, because I was a veil to the glorious appearance, because I was visited by heaven's principal warrior, Machen is my advocate, the bearer of the offering unto the supreme altar of the Most High. Ambrose was murmuring these last lines to himself as the train passed the base of the Mount of Apparition, and the men who had got in at Hereford glanced round nervously and looked at the cord of communication. But Ambrose looked longingly at the boughs of the ash, tossing in the wind on the far mountainside, thinking of the stories told of those who retired to this shrine in the dark ages. Before what was called the flaming picture of the chief angel, these vowed persons would remain 3 whole days and nights in silent devotion, wrapped, so the legend said, far out of the earthly regions and raised to the heavenly places, to the state of paradise, so that when they came down again to the valleys and lower places of the world, they were as those who had voyaged in the blessed isles, since their garments were scented with celestial odors, and about them was the visible shining of light. The train rushed on through the rich and happy meadows, by the wild thickets, by the shimmering fields of corn, by the old white farms. Before his eyes now rose that well-remembered and venerable Myneth Moir. High upon it he could see the line of straggling beeches and the walls of Craddock's house, gleaming in the sunlight. His heart thrilled at the thought of that which rested there, concealed in a dark place, of the holy cup in its glistening veils of samite. It was as yesterday that he bent low before those ghostly splendors, and saw the images of immortal things that showed in the crystal mirror of the blessed work. The golden wood resounding with the magic summons of the bells, the far-lifted sanctuary of Cor-arbennic high above the 9th wave, the vision of the saints of Britain sailing on the fairy sea to Avalon. He could scarce see the great dome of the mountain above him, scarce rejoice in the deep woods below, scarce fix his eyes on the white walls by the beeches for the recollection of these clearer marvels that had appeared before him. He felt as though a voice cried to him from that place. The cup seemed to summon him to kneel once more and to behold new visions. Craddock's house passed out of sight, and there rose the great wall of Myneth Main, and far down to the south, Twin Barlam, the lofty height that looks far over land and sea, where the wind is like strong wine. He sank back in the seat and wondered how he could have borne that long and dreary exile. Facti sumus sicut consolati, veniens autumn venient cum exultatione, portantos manipulos suos. He had wondered still more deeply by what compassions he had been preserved in that house of folly which he had inhabited, which he had entered, helpless and defenseless, a little lonely child. How was it that he had not been ruined utterly, that he had not become a practical man, longing for a time when he should be able to do some great work in the world, say, by sitting in the House of Commons? There were lads of his own age who were already bubbling over with enthusiasm in the cause of humanity, who were already beginning to count the rewards that really earnest, disinterested work for one's fellow man seldom fails to procure. They pointed to young Hasley, an old Luptonian who had changed sides twice and was certain to be in the next cabinet of his party, though he was barely 30. Many of the boys, taking the doctor's solemn warnings to heart, had already made friends who would be useful in later life, useful, that is, in forwarding them in their desire to do some good in the world. Ah, how had he escaped from this cesspool, from the discipline and teaching of the masters and the companionship of the boys, without losing his soul forever? Through his father's teaching and the mercy of the compassionate, he said to himself. But what a marvel it was! He had been 9 years at Lupton, and still, and with ever greater awe and adoration, he remembered and venerated the mysteries of the cup of Tylosant. Chapter 2. It was about the middle of the afternoon when he left the local train at Cor-arbennic station and strolled idly through the deserted town, where there had once reigned such splendors and such mysteries. Grass was growing between the cobblestones at the side of the empty, desolate streets. An old man, bent double with rheumatism, was slowly crawling along with the aid of a stick, and seemed the only inhabitant. Ambrose turned aside and walked by the grass-grown way that led to the Roman amphitheatre, and he sat on the old stone stile, looking across the circle of grassy mounds towards the steep wooded hill beyond. There was no breeze now in this enclosed valley, and no leaf stirred. The trees on the hillside were as though they were painted, and a shimmer of heat rose from the grass. He could see the white limestone road winding on the other side of the river. That, too, was empty and forsaken. Cor-arbennic was the city of a bygone day. Its life was but a mouldering memory. The very names over the little shops were strange to him. The bow-windowed grocery, a famous place in its generation, was shuttered up, and he had seen a placard on a wall announcing that at some meeting about something or other, Captain Tillier Smith, J.P., would be in the chair. Who was Captain Tillier Smith? He had never heard of him. It was curious. He knew well enough that his father's old friends at Cor-arbennic had died or left the place many years before, and that a new generation of strangers reigned in their stead. Yet he felt a certain sorrow in the thought that these old ties had been broken, a certain disappointment that, to the welcome of the hills and woods, human tones had not added their friendly voices. The sight of those empty, grass-grown streets, of wide-open places devoid of life, of houses where once his father and he had been welcomed, now in strange hands, of the unknown name on the doctor's door, all these signs had uttered loneliness, and had filled him with mourning for the past. He was to visit strangers, relations, it is true, but he had never seen them, and Cor-arbennic had suddenly reminded him how utterly alone he was in the great world. Some of the boys were decent fellows enough, but they were a part of the chapter called Lupton. If he could think of that chapter without resentment and sickness, it was very well, but it was idle to dream that any of its passages could have any real share in his heart. He was alone, and for the moment he was sad at the thought. He could not help regathering all the memories and fancies that were associated with the place in his mind. He left his station on the stile and wandered about the empty streets, thinking of pleasant evenings spent long ago in this house or in that, of warm welcome and warm comfort, and kind voices and good dead people. There was a little house in a back street where an old lady, an ancient friend of his family, had once lived. Her teas he remembered with a great affection. She always had a particular cake of which he was very fond, and used to produce afterwards from the cupboard some ingenious and novel game which would amuse him for the rest of the evening. A stone cross marked her place in the churchyard. She had died a year after his father's death. He remembered the pictures that had hung in certain rooms that once had been familiar. What had become of the oil painting of the Highlander that used to be over the sideboard at the Garth? And where were the green cut-glass vases that had decorated the mantelpiece in the doctor's drawing-room? The vases were smashed, perhaps, but many of the objects that he remembered must be still in being, scattered about the earth in strange surroundings. Where was the pagoda in carved ivory that had stood in a corner of a room at the castle? Where was the serpent which the old vicar had always used as a text for his recollections of church gallery orchestras? Was that picture of some incident in the American War of 1812 still the subject of discussion in some strange household? The Trevors had made it into a kind of after-dinner pastime. One was asked if one knew who the American officer dying in his cabin under the Stars and Stripes could be, and conversation at once became easy, if slightly imbecile. He liked to think that all these varying objects had somehow escaped the common lot, that they delighted no strange eyes, lay derelict and despised in no distant seaside lodgings, mouldered in no shop. Rather, in the land of the unknown, there was a house of memory in which they were all gathered together, and here the wraiths of the old Cor-arbennic folk met together under the united signs of the serpent and pagoda, the Highlander and the sea captain. There they discussed to a happy eternity the old fireside stories, found the clue to knotty genealogical problems that had puzzled all their days of mortal life, settled at last the question how Matilda Kirby came to be one of the Williamses of Pontonnuith, and issued in a final and authentic form the true history of Evan Owen, the Red House's marriage to Joan Morris, Penyrall. And after the wedding they went to live at Wiveliscombe. That's all I know. That used to be the conclusion. But in the House of Memory all doubts would be resolved, and the identity of that United States officer would be clearly established. There had never been much uncertainty as to the Highlander. He was Vish Imvor, a character in an old romance, once a great favourite. Happy friendly folk! It was certain that there were good suppers in the house of their habitation, and afterwards there was something hot and comfortable. He wandered at last over the bridge, and strolled along the old Usk road, till from a gate he had a clear view of Cor-arbennic standing above the river, the old white inn, with mullioned 16th-century windows nearest to the yellow water and the wet shining banks, and above, in tiers, the houses rising all bright in the sunlight. Away from the river, the north of the town was bordered by stately Lombardy poplars. Indeed, there were many green leaves within the circuit of the walls, orchards of apples and pears and quince trees, and here and there the more sombre ilex made spaces of refreshment between the huddled roofs. And all about the town the level meadows were spread broad and green, dotted here and there with ancient thorns, and as he leaned over the gate, it was the turn of the tide, and the salt savour came up from the Severn Sea. Far to the north, the valley followed the winding river. Deep Wentwood, the old forest, rose high to the east. To the west, there was a maze of rolling hills, bounded by the vast mountain. He was gazing on the white walls, luminous in the sunlight, when the silence of the valley was broken by a man's voice singing as he came along the lane from the north. The words, as far as any words could be distinguished, sounded foreign, and Ambrose looked round with some curiosity. The man came towards him with a swinging stride, and when he saw Ambrose by the gate, he stopped his odd song, the tune of which sounded as outlandish as the words. He looked like a sailor. His skin was burned to the hue of copper by fierce suns, and he carried a bundle on a stick over his shoulder. Ambrose wished him good day as he was going by, and the man hesitated a moment, and then said, "Could you manage the price of a pint? I've tramped 30 miles already, and I fancy I've got a good many more before I get to Cardiff." Ambrose gave him a shilling, and asked whether he was looking for a ship. "I'm much obliged to you, sir," he said. "Yes, I want a ship. Something easy, to Bordeaux and back would suit me, though I wouldn't mind Trieste." He called it Tri-East. "You've been abroad a lot." "I have. I've been inland too, as well as on board ship. The Levant, India, Persia, all sorts of places, at all sorts of jobs. Yes, I've travelled a lot." "Have you seen any Indian juggling?" "Lord, yes, plenty. It's all fake, if you ask me. They're clever, you know, sir, but people tell a lot of lies about them when all's said. There's that rope trick they talk of. I never seen it, and I never see anybody who did. A man must be drunk to believe nonsense like that, so it seems to me, though some of them can tell fortunes most wonderful." "You mean they come true?" "Yes, I'm certain of it. An Arab fellow that I'd got out of a nasty mess when I was about the Levant taught me a way of his own, so he said, and I never found it fail." "I wish you'd try to tell mine." said Ambrose, who was amused by this encounter. "Here's another bob." The sailor-man was well enough pleased. He had the potentiality of many pints in his pocket, and the thought, as he said in his own fashion, lightened the burden of the 15 or 16 miles to Cardiff, or certain pints might be foregone and the balance expended on lodging for travellers. In any case, his position was secure. He set down his crimson bundle under the hedge, and taking the stick, prepared deliberately for magic. Ambrose sat on the gate and fixed his eyes on the proceedings, though he felt sure that it would all end in a fair woman who had a fortune. Still, the method might be novel. The wanderer glanced to the road and found, as it happened, a considerable stretch of smooth sand, which the last rainstorm had washed into a bay of the bank. On this, with the end of his stick, he very deliberately and carefully drew certain letters of the alphabet, all in capitals. He set them down in an order of his own: A, B, G, D, H, V, and so forth, ending with T. There were 22 in all, and some of them he shaped oddly, because, as he explained, they were not the common letters that the children learned at school. This done, he rolled his eyes impressively, to the huge delight of Ambrose, who felt that he was almost getting his money's worth. And then he asked the number of letters in his client's name. Of this information he made a memorandum on the edge of the sand, and then with the tip of his stick he began to punch the sand with aimless rows of little dents. It was a long and complicated process. There was much counting and reckoning at the end of it. Some of the punch marks were smoothed out, and others, in odd figures and patterns, took their places. He looked up at last with a disquieted air. "Beg your pardon, sir, but you're English, aren't you?" "Yes, of course," said Ambrose. "Why?" "Well, you see you're fixed to the T." He pointed to the letter. "I can't make it out." "Why? What does that mean?" The man shuffled uneasily. "Shut up in prison, or something of that kind, I believe." He lied with difficulty and confusion, and took up his bundle again. "It's nonsense, of course, sir, you being an English gentleman. But there, you don't want to believe in such things. As I said, I expect it's all fake. I must be getting on now, sir, and thank you, I'm sure." He hurried off towards Carmain, turning back once at the corner, and looking at Ambrose with startled eyes for a moment, and then he was gone. And Ambrose laughed to himself. Evidently some horrid fate which the sailor dared not utter was prophesied for him, and he wondered what it could be. And then, while he looked at the letter T on the sand, the words of the Frenchman at the cafe came into his mind, and he remembered what the old Irish fiddler had said years before. He jumped off the gate and began to run after the sailor, but though he ran through the village as far as the bridge, the man was not to be seen, and an old woman sitting at her door told him that no such person had passed by. Indeed, the wanderer had anticipated Ambrose's course, and watched the pursuit through a hole in the hedge behind which he lay secure. He did not wish to be forced into explanations, and he cursed the Kabbalah of Bemuling, who, as it happened, was not an Arab at all, but a Levantine Jew. It was late in the afternoon, and Ambrose strolled once more through Carmain. It was time to think of the Werne, and he went along the road, beside the river meadows, till he came to a stile that he knew of old. He wondered whether he could remember the way. It led, he knew, by the verges of deep woods, by wild hills and lonely valleys. One passed the ruinous chapel in the middle of the gorse-grown field, and the sore brook was crossed by a narrow, trembling bridge. The path was but an uncertain thread, for few used it, and the bridge was so masked by the rich growth of dark, glossy alders that it was easy to miss the right point. "The divinations of sailor and fiddler, the prophecy of the Frenchman," said Ambrose, "passed from me when once I entered again those enchanted hills, those woods of most dear recollection. Even before I had turned from the road, a procession of happy children met me. They had been flower-gathering, for the local flower show, perhaps, and they came towards me as if they had been participants in some old festival. In front there were 2 girls who bore great spires of valerian. I remember that it grew on the rocky bank a little further down the road, where in its shadows flowered also the golden St. John's wort. The children with the valerian flowers wore such a look of joy. The hair of one was black, of the other golden, that I forgot the strange significance which the flower thus carried used to bear in Gwent. I suppose, indeed, that the old symbolism of Canos Corvae has now become extinct. Behind these 2 came their companions, boys and girls, bearing their red and yellow, blue and white, but most of all, great bunches of creamy meadow sweet that scented all the air. Some, with a pretty face, had made spare flowers into twisted garlands, which they wore on their bare heads, and they had evidently been by marshy as well as flowery soil, for a few had woven rushes into fantastic shapes, and bore baskets which reminded me of the mystic ferns carried by another older procession. And one ingenious lad had made of these materials a fearsome-looking monster, a species of dragon, which he waved in the air. Last of all came 2 boys carrying great reeds and flags gathered by the river bank, and as a flower dropped here and there, they left a faint track of blossoms behind them. And just as they passed, one of them must have produced his penny whistle, for I heard the faint notes of an old tune piped as I turned aside from the road, and began to climb the green hill towards the wood. And before the boy's uncertain music was lost in the distance, a bird sang to me, darkling from the shadow of the trees, and after the bird the ripple of the brook rose up through the still valley, and after the sound of the clear water there was the whisper of the evening breeze among the leaves of the hedge. It seemed as if all the way enchantments beckoned to me. I found that I remembered the path quite well, but again and again I was tempted to go astray, to explore unknown valleys, to climb round and solitary hills, to penetrate into the green light that shone from the recesses of the woods that as a boy I had never visited. I wondered what I might not find if I entered that little vale that opened towards the west, half screened by a hazel thicket, and what country should I see if I stood on that hilltop amongst the waving bracken. I regained that afternoon all the sense that I had had in the same land when I was a little boy, the sense of a dweller in a mystic territory, whose every path may lead to fairyland, where magic dwelt in the brooks, in the flowers, in the green woodland, and on the bare, turfy height. Only a little was known. A few feet beyond the path might lie the entrance to the enchanted region. That white thorn bush on the hillside might be the resort of the 3 fairy birds of Rhiannon. Those broken stones might hide the entrance to a cavern filled with Celtic treasure, with the gold ornaments of old kings and heroes, with the last books of Merlin's wisdom, and the figures of his spells. But I persevered on my way, and the sun was still above Minith Main when I stood again before the door of the Wairn, and said my salve. Chapter 3. Ambrose Merrick always asserted that he had written 12 books concerning his visit to the Wairn. These books, he said, formed a great prose romance, intermingled with certain songs, mysteries, episodes, and parables. He has been heard to declare that he must shortly set about the revision of the manuscript and prepare this magnum opus for the press. He even quoted titles of some of the books on occasions. There were the Silvia in Silva, the Mysterium Calicis, the Hypnerotomachia, the Nuptia Mysticae, the Mons Magorum, the Nox Illuminans, the Cantus Planos, and 1 or 2 others that have vanished from all record. It is, however, very doubtful whether the great romance ever existed in so tangible a form as manuscript. It is, with more probability, conjectured to have been the reflection of a glowing dream that was always shining vaguely in Ambrose's mind, which he hoped, perhaps, to reduce to a corporeal shape at some indefinite opportunity. He felt, it is believed, that the theme must be treated more than worthily, with a rare and curious eloquence, and he wished for a time when he should feel within him fit force and inspiration for the carrying out of this great design. As it is, in place of complete books, there are only notes and fragments, and of these all possible advantage must be taken. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it is hard to say which, these jottings and memoranda are expressed in such a manner that the meaning is often excursively obscure, as was evident when they were mischievously submitted to the judgment of a well-known authority in literary questions, the famous author of "Get on, and be quick about it." This gentleman wrote that there was capital stuff in the manuscript. All that it wants, he said, is a little arrangement and a liberal use of the blue pencil. With some telling illustrations, I think it would do well as a Christmas book for young children. Why not, indeed? Gulliver's Travels, by the genial, kindly Dean of St. Patrick's, is to be found on every well-regulated nursery bookshelf, and Ambrose's notes do certainly suggest the atmosphere of a fairy tale. So far as this famous visit can be regarded from the common outlook, it seems to have been a very pleasant one. The old house was just the same as he recollected it. No alterations had been made without or within. The two sides of an unfinished quadrangle in grave grey stone still fronted to west and south, looking across the broad terraced lawn, the sunken lane, and the marshy land, across the winding brook and the wooded hills, glancing on one side towards Wentwood, the wilderness of leaves, and on the other to the great wall of Mineth Main. The stone mullions and transoms were still there in the windows. No attempt had been made to reform the diamond quarries into plate-glass panes. It was old tinged glass, full of whorls and flaws and inequalities, and it shed a dim, soft light on the old furniture and the old pictures, both dating for the most part to the middle of the 18th century. As chance visitors had said, if one wanted to live in an old curiosity shop, one had better do so at once. Those sensible people would prefer real chairs and tables, and windows that one could see through. These people were still mid-Victorians in those days. Now their houses are furnished throughout in bad imitations of 18th century furniture, known to the owners under the comprehensive name of Chippendale. It does not matter. There are many other subjects left for them to talk balderdash about. Books, pictures, music, religion. Imbecility, ignorance, impudence will never lack their due pasture, and for some good but obscure reason, the imbeciles and scoundrels always seem to get off scot-free. Wilson and Lockhart, for example, are still respected names. Yes, it was all the same. There was a little book with a curious binding in stamped gold still on a side table, just as he remembered it. And while he admired this reverence, his cousin, Mr. Vaughan, came in, cordial but evidently nervous. He was a short, thick old man with a square white beard, at which he tugged in moments of excitement, and there was a slight stammer in his voice as he made Ambrose welcome to his old home. "You will want to come permanently, I suppose, before long," he said. "We shall be sorry to leave. I admired your father. I have tried to keep everything as it was in his day." "You have been wonderfully good," said Ambrose. He pointed to the book. "I remember that book, just in that place when I was a little boy." It was evident that Ambrose was not a loud boy. His voice was low, and he did not shout all the evening. Sylvia Vaughan, a dark girl, appeared just before dinner, and afterwards they sat out on the lawn. Mr. Vaughan was pleased to find that Ambrose smoked. He always said that it was one of the greatest proofs of the insensate folly of all schoolmasters that they prohibited tobacco, since a mild sedative was evidently the very thing that the average schoolboy wanted. "Wild hearts must be hocused for the safety of the public," he said. "Schoolboys are wild hearts. Therefore they should be hocused. Conclusum est in Barbara." He was ready to prove his minor premise by innumerable instances. One would have thought that he had specialized in schoolboys all his days. In reality, All these remarks were generalizations from a noisy young nephew who had stayed with the Vaughans many years before. But Ambrose was quiet and talked sense. He had some information about the existence of the pointed arch in Ireland, in churches that were certainly of the 11th century, and possibly of the 10th. Mr. Vaughan was most interested. He said that he could not quite agree with the conclusion of Ambrose's father that the existence of these arches showed that Gothic architecture, properly so called, was of Celtic origin. Still, the point was highly important. And then they talked about rhyme. Was it brought into Europe from the East or not? Ambrose ventured to think that it was an independent growth. He quoted the Easter sequence, Victimae Paschali, as an instance of rhyme in a very rudimentary state. Then back to Celtum. What was the deduction to be drawn from those curious references to the introduction of the chalice in the Percival and in the Lower Brack? How far were certain features of the Celtic Church and of Celtic ornament to be set down to Egyptian influence? The night was so calm and windless that when a servant brought out a 2-branched silver candlestick and set it on the little table beside them, the flame rose clear and unflickering. "God send us the light of heaven," said Mr. Vaughan when the candles were brought, and Ambrose remembered that the use of this ejaculation was a custom that George Herbert's country parson liked very well. The faint glow shone about Sylvia's face. It was as if a hidden glory flowed from her as she sat smiling, well pleased that her father had found at last someone to talk to. On the one side was her dark beauty, her hair drawn down from her forehead over her ears, in a style that was then, though, uncouth, unfashionable, and hideous. And on the other was the shadowy valley of the Soar, whence the fragrance of the meadow-sweet ascended with the fragrance of the wood, whence at intervals rose the lonely piping of some bird. Soft from afar came the whirring note of the farm-owl. He was deep in the bracken on that high vague hill towards the south, and without ceasing they heard the murmur of the brook. Mr. Vaughan was quite overjoyed. His few neighbors thought him a very queer old man who was always reading old books, a vice from which they were singularly free. He, on his side, thought them noodles and boobies, and perhaps there was a good deal to be said for both opinions. But he often longed for someone with whom he could talk about the many outlandish subjects which interested him, and Ambrose was more than satisfactory. But how long could he go on like this? Would he not begin to expatiate presently on his achievements at the games? Horbury had laid stress on Ambrose's athletic abilities. He would certainly show how to meet Bogler's bowling. Probably the fit would take him quite suddenly, and he would begin to shout and rush about. Or perhaps he would illustrate his theory of drop-kicking, with the little table serving instead of the ball. But Ambrose went on smoking quite placidly. He was speaking with some enthusiasm of the beauty of Old French, and maintaining that the modern language, in spite of its swift and exquisite charm, had lost a great deal by having no equivalent to the English Bible. "In fact," he said, "at times I almost feel as if there were something to be said for the English Reformation. Not much, of course. Suppose that in every deceased leper a surgeon could dissect out a beautiful jewel. There would be something to be said for leprosy." Mr. Vaughan grinned with delight. "Lupton must be a wonderful school," he said. "You went in a lot for games, Horbury tells me." He wanted to know the worst. His cousin looked gravely at him. He could not conceive that such a sensible old man would take the slightest interest in the school games, so he answered indirectly. "As I was coming along in the train today, I passed a field with a lot of goats in it. A good many of them were quite young. I assure you, sir, I never saw anything quite so fantastic or quite so jolly as the sport these kids were having, leaping yards into the air to clear a small stream about a foot wide, stopping dead in the middle of a run because there was an oyster shell or a bit of glass in the way, butting at each other with such solemnity, such an evident appreciation of the rules, that it made me roar with laughter." Yes, said old Mr. Vaughan. What then? Well, I've seen a half-dozen dirty little boys having a splendid time with the lamp-post and 2 jackets as wickets, and 2 sticks and a big bundle of paper as bat and ball in the back streets of Lupton. Quite so. Mr. Vaughan's pipe gurgled with enjoyment. Proceed. And farm labourers, in a good old-fashioned skittle alley with lots of good beer. They enjoy themselves too, but if you were to paint the kids with coloured stripes, or made rules about the weight of the paper ball, or insisted on all farm labourers up to the age of 80 playing skittles twice a day, then I think the whole thing would become a beastly nuisance. How the farm labourers especially would hate it if the parson brought in allusions to the dry alley regularly every Sunday, and drew lessons from the man who always takes the heaviest cheese, and the man who can never finish his beer on time, and mixed up the skittles with the kings of Israel and Judah. And fancy the small boys being harried to the lamp-post and thrashed severely if they didn't play up. Of course, the goats wouldn't stand it for a moment, even if they were instructed in the valuable formative influence on the goat character of high jumping and butting. Old Mr. Vaughan roared. He made much more noise than the loud schoolboy of his dreams. Come in, he said. I have some really old whiskey. Kiss him good night, Sylvia, he added as they stood in the hall. We are going to sit up talking till any hour you please. Ambrose blushed scarlet as the beautiful Sylvia bent forward and kissed his cheek as a matter of course. It was clear that he had discovered the earthly paradise. He bent low and took her hand and kissed her fingertips, and she smiled at him with kind eyes. The old man and he went to the study, where the servant had set the whiskey ready. All the old books were in their place, but Mr. Vaughan had utilized a vacant space to set up a large bookcase with his own special volumes. It was an extraordinary collection, the famous Ducange, the works of Duns Scotus, and several other of the schoolmen, collections of rhymed Latinity, some books on medieval costume, a great array of Graal romances, monastic records, one tall gradual, splendidly illuminated on parchment leaves, Histoire des Filles de Joie au Moyen Âge, and a manual of the tarot. These were a few of the oddities that caught Ambrose's eye as he glanced about him before sitting down. It is like a great wood, he said, as they poured out their drink, pointing to his cousin's bookcase. Everything is to be found in it, from the oak to the scarlet fungus, and one hears the bubbling of the wells, the dripping of cold springs, the sound of the wind, and the rustling of little furry beasts in the undergrowth. Yes, it is an amusing collection, isn't it? I find them all useful for the romance I am writing. Ambrose tried to hear more about this romance, but his cousin would say nothing. It was not till some days had passed that Mr. Vaughan trusted his cousin with the secret of the romance. He was writing it in a kind of faked low Latin, and though his scheme was not much more foolish than that one which William Morris wrote his romances in Old English of his own invention, yet Ambrose had much ado to contain himself. Indeed, the idea rather appealed to him. There was a fantastic unreasonableness about it that was after his own heart. And yet it was so funny that he went for a walk directly after he heard this great matter. He walked briskly, puckering his cheeks all the way, and when at last he was a mile or so from the Warren, he lay down and rolled in the grass, roaring and shrieking and bellowing with laughter till he was quite faint. Old Mr. Vaughan had shown him a leaf of his manuscript, and he had seen a chapter title, Haga de Giardino, which meant the garden hedge. It was, somehow, more than he could bear. Yet, if he listened to the old man, his scheme seemed absolutely logical. It was quite impossible to resist the cogency of his arguments. You see, he said, in the first place, I, personally, regard the English language as a quite impossible medium of expression, for the present, that is. Of course there must come an end to the present corruption. Liberal and conservative politicians, Anglican bishops, dissenting preachers, wealthy manufacturers, and journalists will not be suffered to rule the land forever. When the politicians and manufacturers are hanged, when the bishops and the preachers are burnt, By the way, I should make the fire slower for the bishops. Then, perhaps, English may become fit once more for the use of a man of letters. The journalists, I forgot, they will have to eat their own words, of course, the worst torture of all. But now, do you know that a man who doesn't split his infinitives or use like for as is regarded as a very affected person, a kind of euphemist? They say literature is meant for the people, and the people have no time for hair-splitting over words and sentences. This is a democratic age, you know, and the people, I suppose, must have darned hot stuff, or 40 million Englishmen will know the reason why. Exaggerating? Nothing of the kind. You can't have read the papers, or you wouldn't talk such nonsense. Exaggerating? Look what this ass says. This gigantic, gargantuan, super-imbecile jolthead. Look, I have cut him out. I should like to cut him up. Do you see that he says that Keats and Ruskin were so full of their subject that they had no time to consider themselves as literary craftsmen? Who is going to write English when slugs like that have crawled all over the language? Why, it's like finding a toad, a blindworm, 3 snails, and a dozen, woodlice in a meat pie, and then finishing it. Here he goes again, the unfailing instinct of the great public. Authors should make it their aim to preach to this great public. He pretends to think, this lunatic, that what he calls the great public have some voice and authority in literature. About as much of either as the passengers on a liner have over the navigation of the ship. No, it's quite out of the question for a self-respecting man to have anything to do with such a literary world as this. Therefore, my only course is to write my romance in Low Latin, a fine tongue, a most flexible medium, a synthesis of the ancient world and the modern, possessing the sonority and splendor of the Old Latin, mingled with the life and movement of the new languages. It has never had journalism written in it, and it never will. Ambrose ventured to put a cautious question as to the public to which Mr. Vaughan hoped to appeal, and his cousin pointed out that he would speak to the learned over the whole world, since he would be using a language which was understood by everyone with the slightest pretensions to education. I shall be read by Frenchmen, Germans, Mexicans, Russians, Swedes, and citizens of Guatemala. I shall appeal to an expert audience from which the populace are entirely excluded. I shall restore the art of letters to its proper dignity as a great craft, a mystery. Oh, there are innumerable advantages in my plan. For example, I saw in a review the other day that it was a pity Mr. Thingamy, who wrote so well, should produce a book which could not possibly be put into the hands of a young girl. I shall escape all that. No one would ever dream of placing a Low Latin romance in the hands of a young girl, or of an old one either. He began to talk of the beauties of his medium, of the strange music which it gave so readily. It is like an old violin, he said. It is permeated with melody. It sounds and echoes with the enchanted song of the age when it came into being. It chants of crenellated walls, of great cathedral glories. It has the savours of Gascon wine, drunk in painted taverns. It smells of incense. It has seen the rich wonders of old cities. It knows the dimness of the cloister, the trumpets and the clamour of the tournament, the rapture of the hidden saints, the revelry of flowery festivals. And mark, it has never been tainted by the defilement of popularity, and it has never been the means by which the mob has uttered its foolishness and its wickedness. All that is of good in the people it is assimilated, and yet it has always worn the garments of the Latin life. It is a peasant, if you please, but a peasant who has received the sacerdotum, and is entitled to wear the vestments of the church. Nobody has ever been interviewed in Low Latin, and in it leading articles never will be written. And speaking of music, you see this song I have just written in the Phrygian mode. Look at these neumes. You observe the peculiar shape of the podactus and the biverga. I shall insist on an exact reproduction. It is most important. and Ambrose went out and hid himself in remote places, giving way to inextinguishable mirth. It might be all very true. It might be, as his cousin said, that the chosen medium was the exact equivalent in language to the Gothic in architecture, the marriage of the Latin genius to the Teutonic and Celtic. Yet it was all a farce in 5 acts, an elaborate and staged absurdity. There were many pleasant days and nights at the Warren. He went for long walks with his cousin Sylvia, revisiting many revered places of ancient pilgrimage. He looked up authorities for the old man, and one day delighted him by solemnly burning, in the face of the pig Walter Map, his cricket bat and flannels. The days passed in ceaseless sunshine. All the nights were laden with the odor of the dewy fields and the running brook, of the procession of leaves and flowers. Chapter 4. In the notebook marked The Warren, there is a kind of preface which relates, presumably, to that great romance which has been mentioned, to the tale which Ambrose was always hoping to tell some day. I feel sure, it begins, that all art should be profoundly ethical if it is to deserve the capital A, if it is to be art at all. I am told that this point has been insisted on lately, and I am very glad of it. One hopes that these sermons will have some result, that people who are worthy of better things will cease to produce the horrible manufactured article which has grown so common of late, which, so far from having any ethical relation, is patently the result of a desire to please a great number of 10th-rate intelligences, and to make a big income. I suppose it is hardly necessary to say that work produced under such conditions, and with such beggarly aims, can have no conceivable relation with any system of morals known to man. I suppose that a fetish priest in an African swamp would reject an offering made in such a spirit as unclean and detestable, as very bad medicine. Let us by all means and in all ways insist on the high morality which is demanded of all art and of every artist. It is delightful and surprising to hear that this is being done. It is one of the best signs of the times that I have heard of. I am glad that the tide has turned, that literature and painting are once more to take their true position, which, after all, is a higher one than that of the thimble rigger and company promoter. If we once have the writer of books and the painter of pictures recognizing that their work is done under the highest ethical sanctions for the highest ethical ends, we shall soon hail an instaurutia magna in the arts. Of course, I take it for granted that the ethics in question are thoroughly human ethics, that they relate to the life of that most exalted miracle that is called man in the most exalted region of which he is capable. I feel satisfied of this, because writers who are taking up the high standpoint of which I have been told, who are ready, doubtless, to face the jeers and sneers of readers whose conception of morals is chiefly derived from the lessons given in the dissenting Sunday school, writers such as these, I say, are, of course, aware of the mystic wonder with which man has been crowned. They know that he is permitted to look into mysteries which are hidden from the holy angels. Man, it may be said, is called upon to sing a perpetual mass, to offer a continual sacrifice. There is a beautiful passage in Potter's Marius. It is a description of the Eucharist of the early Christians. Marius saw the offerings of the faithful, the bread and wine and oil, and was struck with the exquisite symbolism by which the dull, dead matter was, as it were, borne up to heaven, transmuted with a quickening word, consecrated to the service of a great mystery. But, in truth, this high and especial service apart, such offering should be of daily, nay, hourly, obligation. It would be a great work to investigate and enumerate all the wonderful privileges and offices of man. Perhaps there are many which have been forgotten, a few even yet to be discovered. But surely this mystical and universal priesthood must be among the highest of his prerogatives. It is his right and duty to offer not only the bread and wine of the Eucharist, but all the universe. Day by day, at sunrise and evening, in the darkness of the night, he is bound to say, Jube haec preferi per manus sancti angeli tui in sublimi altare tuum, in conspectu divina majestatis tuae. Every day he should secretly utter the prayer, and do thou, uncovering the veils of enigmas which mystically surround this holy rite, make them gloriously manifest to us, and fill our spiritual eyes with ineffable light, and having cleansed our poverty from every pollution of the flesh, make it worthy of this fearful and dread hierarchy. What are haec? What is this holy rite? Why, these things are the whole world, from the clod to the stars, all sounds and sights and colors, all heights and depths, all rivers and seas, rain and snow and frost and wind, the voice of the thunder and the breeze in the brake. And not only these, but all sensation and emotion, all thought and all desire, all joy and grief, the raptures and the longings of the soul, the venoms and black poisons of life also. For in this rite there is a transmuting word, which can change these latter into golden and most precious elixirs. This is the perpetual mass of all humanity, which, as I say, we are all bounden to offer according to the measure of our gifts. We are to bring the whole universe to the supernal altar, praying that the veils of enigmas may be uncovered, that the transmutation may be effected, that the great work may be accomplished, that the Graal may be revealed. Let us consider a moment. What is Lincoln Cathedral but a heap of stones dug out of the earth and offered, and transfigured into mystery and splendor? There are stones of the same sort in a stink factory, in a Protestant meeting house, in an ugly modern street, in a railway station. Again, here is an extract from a dissenting tract called Jesus and Company Limited. Chairman, the Almighty Himself. Manager, the Lord Jesus. Secretary, the Holy Spirit and Comforter. Head Offices, Beulah Land. Branch Offices, Thornhill Church. But this horror, this foulness, is made out of words, and words are the material used in Round thee blow, self-pleached deep, bramble roses, faint and pale, and long purples of the dale, let them rave. These in every shower creep, through the green that folds thy grave, let them rave. One man sees the earth and devotes it to industrialism. Another man, who sees the same earth, fills the Turner Room at the National Gallery. What a hierarchy then is this, which, from matter in itself nothing, capable indeed of serving the worst and basest ends, can effect the great miracle of beauty, raising the dead stones into a shrine of glory, making the common words into a wonderful poem. Indeed, gloria et honora coronasti eum, giving him the power of this great magistry. I take it for granted, then, that when ethics are insisted on as the basis and the end of all art, the word is to be taken in its very highest sense, that the ethics in question are to be supremely human ethics, concerned with man in his highest exaltation. I take this for granted because I cannot for a moment conceive that any writer out of an idiot asylum would insist on art being in the popular and vulgar sense moral, that is, the conveyance through an unsuitable medium of a copybook maxim. The colored supplements are often moral in this sense, and in the fiction of the Reverend E.P. Roe it is difficult to find a page without its lesson, duly pointed. One need not say that such art as this is not art at all, and is in the highest sense profoundly and bestially immoral and degraded. The Venus of Milo is one of the greatest moralities that man ever conceived and executed. The little colored statuette of the child feeding the kitten out of a saucer is a filthy outrage on artistic ethics. So when I hear that the ethical basis of art is being fervently advocated, I am delighted, because I am certain that the word cannot be used in a wrong sense. Ethical art cannot possibly be meant to refer to imbecilities which are infinitely below the artistic standard of the most degraded savages. I am glad, too, because once this high view of art is accepted, we shall hear no more of that hideous nonsense about books or pictures being of no practical use, of no practical interest. One does not know exactly what meaning the anthropoids who write this attach to the word practical, but one is forced to suppose that they are repeating in another form the dicta of an able animal named Macaulay, who said that the Platonic philosophy was of no use because it had not led to any inventions which increased the comforts or conveniences of life. Pour être vraiment grand il faut être l'inventeur du nouveau cabinet hygiénique et laxatif. I have no doubt the philosophy of the learned pig is a very good one, for the learned pig. I am sure that the amiable and in his own way sagacious animal would sternly denounce as impractical anyone who hung his sty with old masters and recited to him the works of Homer while he dined. But I object to his probable opinions being adopted as the final standards of literary and artistic criticism. But if I ever write the romance I dream of so often, if I ever finish the Sylvia, I shall be prepared for the old sentence. It will be censured as unpractical, because it teaches no useful arts. It will not tell of the cheapest method of converting gangrened pork into sausages, nor will it facilitate the poisoning off of our superfluous children by means of tuberculosis milk. Certainly not a book for sturdy, practical men, for the descendants of the stout old Roundheads. Need I say that Master will have none of it? Master will pronounce it to be profoundly immoral, as he licks his greasy chops over the fat bacon and the full and full-flavored report of the West End scandal in the Daily Something. Master is a strong believer in the liberty of the press, but as a moral man, he cannot and will not tolerate impure and licentious literature. It is probable that if Ambrose had set himself to writing his book, instead of writing about it, the Sylvia would have been brought to a happy ending. As it is, there are but odd notes and fragments, mere rough sketches for the tale that was never to be written. The following excerpt is chosen for its intimate bearing on Ambrose Merrick's inner life. It is written partly in the third person, partly in the first. Here it is reduced for the sake of uniformity to the third, and a good deal of editing has been found necessary, many of the sentences being incomplete. It was written, presumably, in a sudden burst of energy, and the words are scrawled across the page in a hasty, untidy hand. He lived, then, the happy life. In that enclosed valley, under the shelter of the hill, by the singing brook, he felt as though, after all those intolerable years in the house of torment and folly and lies, he had entered into the great dream, which is the golden hope or the high memory of all who know. It is called a dream, not because it is unreal, but because in that state, as in a happy and well-directed dream, desire and fulfillment are one. Silver moons can be summoned down to earth to bathe in haunted wells. Rose gardens blossom amidst the snows, and singing choirs are not wanting, nor wine nor fairy feasts. The world, as it were, is melted in the crucible of a wonderful alchemy. It is dissolved in the throes of a mighty transmutation, and the hard and stubborn rock is once more that plastic mirror in which all things are seen and all visions are realized. The doctors of the mysteries have many names for this state, and have indicated its existence under various and strange figures, and they have described the method of its attainment by symbolisms which are, perhaps, designedly confused and confusing. Though of all the veils of concealment that have been hung before the portal of this palace, none is thicker nor more impenetrable than that which is woven with strange and fantastic images of deceit, and is called occultism. For those who pay more than a moment's attention to this veil, which should be brushed harshly aside, are captured by its curious follies, and, while they trace its pentacles and sigils, suppose that they have attained the object of their desires. It is doubtless well that this is so, since those who would gaze on such things have uncleansed eyes that are not fit to behold beauty. The true guides, as has been said, describe what they know by many and varying signs, and the books in which these matters are contained lie open for all men to read and understand, if they will and if they can. Thus the secret is most safe, though there is no pledge of secrecy, and indeed very often no hint that the mysteries are being painted before our eyes. The secret is safe because these writings have always two senses, the inner and the outer, and the uninitiated never fail to choose the outer meaning, which, indeed, has its own beauty of the lower order, and would think anyone who declared that there was an inner meaning to be mad. They may even be told of this secret significance, and to them it is as if one pretended to find words in the wind. It is declared that there are many ways of approach to the gate of the great dream. Some, it is supposed, have found the way through a great sorrow, others through a great joy, and again there are the paths of renunciation and conformity. It may also be that year by year a drop of water falls into the cup till at last, all suddenly, it bubbles over, and the thirsty are refreshed by these runnings which they never looked for, since a drop of water is but a little thing. But in the day of overflowing, they say vidi aquam, etc. It is not denied that there are truly many greater things than this state, since indeed it is not the end of the journey, but rather a place of refreshment by the way. As the shadow of a great rock in a dry and thirsty land, it is a refuge from the burning and feverish heats, from the hailstorms and the fire showers, from the deadly cold of ice and snow. Ibi fons vivus, fons immortalis, aqua non amara, ibi vera floret rosa rosarum in horto incluso. And though it be not the city which is the end of the journey, no man can deny its great wonders, nor is he at first ready to believe that they can be surpassed. Ambrose had heard hints of this place long before. He had thought, indeed, though he was in great error, that he had attained it, when he quoted the saying of the anointed bard, "With the bodily lips I received the drink of mortal vineyards, with spiritual understanding wine from the garths of the undying. May the great angel intercede for me, that these be mingled in one cup." But that which he enjoyed was but a natural ecstasy, which was permitted him because he sinned in ignorance, and not from malice, nor against the light. Now, however, he was astonished beyond all imagination to find both within and without matters that he had never so much as dreamed of, which indeed he would never have believed unless he had had this experience. He was less foolish than before, or rather, knowing the evil he had done, he was slow to credit the compassions that were passed upon him. He was humble, with great cause for the deepest humility, and knew himself to be more worthy of the fire than of the unction. Yet he was forced to say, though his lips trembled with unworthiness, "Impignasti in oleo caput meum," for truly sense consorted with spirit, and that which was below was as that which was above. Hortus odoribus affluet omnibus hic paradisus, plenac cantitia, plenac grati, gaudia risus. He would gladly say more as to these miracles, but he is forbidden to utter another word, and fears lest he has said too much and has spoken too plainly already. For the secret way is a way of paradox, and those who seek it because it is secret, or for the joys that they believe it will afford, will most assuredly either find nothing, or that which is worse than nothing. It is hard to say and hard to understand, but there is a sense in which it may be said that those who seek shall not find. So let them first consider what matter it is that they seek. Ambrose then lived at the Wern in such happiness that even if it were permitted him, he could never say enough. And for one thing he was ever after unceasingly grateful. If there could be a sun which set, and yet left its radiance and afterglow to shine through all the night, illuminating the darkness, to this his condition could be compared. For though he went out from the house of rest and refreshment, the knowledge he had gained there never left him. And when afterwards he met persons who affirmed that thirst was a delusion of the senses, and that there was no such thing as water in the world, how could he be at all moved by them? He had been thirsty, and he had found a well, fons vuvus, aqua regeneros. And consequently all the finest and most cogent arguments against the existence of water were to him but a curious excess of foolishness, and indeed very singular, as if on a battlefield wounded wretches, parched and burning with horrible desire, should shriek out continuously that it was impossible to suppose for a moment that such a thing as water ever had been or could be. Now he was indeed laden and overladen with benefits. For besides that which has been hinted at, he received the great marvel and miracle of love. It was not many days before Sylvia and he saw in each other's eyes the completion of earthly desires. Sylvia's father, busied with his books and papers, sent them out together in the fields and woods, and often all the day they were together, searching out old paths and new, wandering far over the hills, pressing up the steep sides of the mountain, alone on the endless waste of the summit, severed, it seemed, from all the turmoil of the world on that wild high plain, set with grim limestone rocks, where the unceasing wind sang as it were with the strings of a great harp. Or there were lower heights, all aflower with thickets of golden gorse, and here in some sheltered cove of the unshorn bushes they would rest in the sunlight, hearing the clear wind and the clearer lark above them, in that fine and delicate air scented with the multitude of the yellow blossoms. They loved to find these hidden places, to which sometimes narrow paths, worn by the sheep, led with many and intricate windings, like the turnings and returnings of a labyrinth, and once within the heart of the maze, they would sit at ease, alone with one another, speaking of many things, while the white clouds floated across the sky and the high wind sang. There were other days devoted to the wilder region of the north, beyond the territory of the mountain of the apparition, where the little town rests in the hollow between great hills, between sharp peaks on the one side and a huge dome on the other, where the Gavany flows into the Usk. Beyond this town there is a way up a steep hillside, through a wood of dwarf oak trees, and presently one is aware that one has entered into the world of the mountains, for they stand about on every side, and reach far and far, beyond and beyond, into the deep heart of Wales. Here, then, it is as if one looked upon a sea of wine, for the great purple billows, heather-covered, roll on and follow one another like Atlantic waves. There are green islands of giant bracken there, many fountains of cold water, many swift streams rushing over glittering boulders. There the singing of falling water never ceases in the land of the slopes and valleys below the wine-dark billows of heather. Again, Sylvia led him to the country called the Moors, a strange level plain of marshland and water-dyke and sea-blown fantastic trees that stretches all along the banks of the yellow Severn, where it washes the land of Gwent. They wandered up the grassy alleys of Wentwood. It was a day of the vale, as the old poets of Gwent called such weather. The high Lord Almighty, ruler of heaven's fair mansion, where blessed guests feast for ever, drinking wine of the undying, fashioned the mystery of the world out of precious elements. Gold was assigned to the sun, dominating all regions. Golden are dawn and sunset. Golden is the last reward of the soul. The moon is of silver, of silver the multitude of the stars, and white clouds, and glittering waters, and the mists that arise from them. But I have seen the day of the veil, in which both elements are mingled, when the great luminary is suspended in a silver lantern. I have seen also a shining piece of the Spirit. They set out very early in the morning, by hushed lanes, by woods dripping with the odors of the summer night, by paths through gleaming dewy fields, by the meadow-sweet way, where a tiny brook made a winding, flowing procession across the grass. All the world was tinged with silvery light. Not a cloud appeared in the sky, only a shining canopy. As the veil grew thin, a clear glittering light would sparkle in the fields and in the woods, as if green trees and green grass underwent a white purification. A filtered ray would illuminate for a moment a bough in the luminous shadow, and a sudden gleam would touch the river and blossom on the bare hillside far beyond. They were fishing for salmon as Sylvia and Ambrose crossed the grey ancient bridge, and he told her the story of Elphine, the son of Gwythno Garanhir, when he was exiled from the delights of Britain. In an evil land was Elphine exiled, where there was no green thing, nor any pleasant shadow under the tree of the wood, nor the flowing of bright streams, nor the bubbling of wells. Rocks and grey deserts and burning sands, abounding in scorpions, were all about him, and his heart was sad, because he was ignorant of the way of return, nor could he discover the track that led to the Isle of Britain. But he came at last to the shore, where the grey sea rolled into the land, and as he stood there, desolate, the fish swam in the billows, and the birds flew over the billows, and the wind blew chill on the rocks, and the sky was overclouded, and the rain came hissing down, cold and bitter as death. And as he stood there, shuddering, he heard the salmon in the sea crying to one another, "Why should we stay here? Let us away to Pembro. These waters are inclement. Let us swim to Gwlad Morgan. What delight in the grey water! Let us be gone to the refuge of Gwent." And every salmon leapt in the billows, but one great fish proclaimed, "It is necessary that we await the coracle of the blessed company." Then saw Elphine, a glowing and a shining on the deep. Then saw Elphine, the holy vessel filled with the perfumed glorious company of the saints. Like a strong swan, it beat aside the waves. Speeding like an arrow, it rushed over the billows, blown by the wind of heaven. And a light as of a burning rose flamed on its masthead. Ambrose told no more. He said he had forgotten the rest. They rested for a while on the grey bridge. He was thinking of old dreams, and fancied that he heard above the course of the waters the echo of the saint's bell, thrilling and ringing from beyond the verge of the world. They entered all the wild green region of the wood, which is filled with enchantments. To the south, the city of the legions, and the issue of the Usk into the billows of the sea. To the north, the river streamed like dim silver between unshaken reeds and still blossoms, past the entrances of leafy dells and hollows, under the shadows of many silent woods. As they ascended, the mountain appeared between the breaks in the leaves, and through the veil a white gleam shone on Myneth Mawr, and Ambrose thought it lit on that house where the cup of Tylo was preserved. And sure was he then that the golden voice of the vessel came to him on the air, with certain words that he might never utter nor make known to mortal. He asked Sylvia whether she heard any sound, but she had heard nothing except the pouring of the water of the wayside fountains. They deserted the road and sought the inmost recesses of the wood, by paths of smooth, soft turf, by beechen alleys. The day before there had been a great heat, and the sun had sunk like a palpitating rose into the mountain, and the sky had deepened to a dark and glorious violet, clear and glowing. So now on every blade of grass the dew lay misty, shimmering in the light of the veil, as if the earth were spread with fine green samite. Now they came to the highest ridge of the wood, and trod the green causeway that had once been the way of the eagles. On the one side, they saw the rolling hills bounded by the mountain wall. On the other, they looked down into the deeps and the heights and all the green billows of Wentwood, as it sank into the level. There was a hollow beneath them where the ground was marshy, and there the mist of the night still lay thick, like a white lake, with green leafy shores all around it. They sat on a fallen tree and gazed on the wonder of Wentwood, across the level, across the yellow sea. Ambrose sighed as though his heart were healed. He drew a deep breath of the sweetness of the wood. He remembered little else of that day's adventure. They made their way to the last of the moors, by many winding tracks, by forest deep, by wild bare land, by leafy lane, and by that strange old village that stands in the place of a golden city, bowered in orchards, sunny on the slope, between the wood and the sea. And in the evening, as they returned, suddenly the veil vanished. They saw the deep rose gardens of the sunset, all the world transmuted in the crucible of red light, so that every leaf was but a petal of the great rose, and a crimson river flowed down to the ruddy waters of Carmine. Unawares, they took each other's hands as this miracle was performed, and like children they walked together as the grey night descended. Ambrose finished the story of Elphine as they drew near to the Werne. He said that he was taken up into the ship of the holy ones, that then he saw all the marvels of the world, for they came to the fairy isle beyond the glassy floods, and at last returned with a divine treasure to the havens of Britain, where all men knew that Elphine had been in the state of paradise, for his garments were perfumed and odorous, as with many spices of Arabia. Chapter 5. It is odd enough that when Ambrose's notebook was submitted, as has been stated, in no very respectful spirit to the judgment of an eminent literary authority, the little episode of Elphine and the magic ship, as he called it, was one of the points most emphasized in the great man's very courteous letter. This story in particular, he advises, should be written up for all it is worth. Is the legend really an old one? Would it be possible to get up a discussion as to its sources? Anyhow, it should be expanded, and I know a man who could do some capital-colored plates to illustrate it. This emphasis is odd, because, as it happens, Ambrose returns to the tale himself, and illustrates it in his own fashion, which is a different one from that proposed by the authority. He does not continue the love story, if there is a love story, of Sylvia and himself. A line is drawn across the page of manuscript, and the following dissertation takes the place of the colored plates. Many explanations have been given of this curious mythos of Elphine and the coracle of the blessed. It is not necessary to do more than mention Professor Evans's very ingenious and original conjecture that Elphine was a solar deity, that the saints are really dawn goddesses, and that the treasure is evidently the sun, returning in splendor after the rigors of winter, or perhaps after the darkness of night. A later scientific authority has demonstrated, with immense learning, that Elphine is most certainly a culture god. The treasure may be some sacred object or fetish deemed essential to the success of the crops, but is more probably the seed itself, symbolizing vitality, and the constancy of the reproductive forces of nature. This demonstration also may be mentioned and passed by, since folly is wearisome, even though it be learned. In the old Welsh manuscript at the Werne, which my father had catalogued, from the colour of its very ancient binding, as the Red Book of Llancarfon, neither the sun nor the crops are assigned these important functions in the genesis of the myth. Instead of these matters, there is a curious dialogue poem in which St. Cadoc, surnamed the Wise, is supposed to answer the question of a disciple. There are in all 150 verses, but those which relate to the coracle and the divine treasure are as follows. Venerable Cadoc, illustrious in the company of the saints, inform me, I entreat you, concerning the ship of the blessed. Whence did it sail? From what far regions? Excellent disciple, you ask of a great matter. Be instructed, then, concerning the holy vessel. It sailed from a far region, from the exceeding brightness. It sailed from the great deeps, from the bottomless abysses, where the light of this world is as midnight darkness. It proceeded from the region which is named God. Its flight was swift as the lightning, the billows boiled beneath it. Its radiance was terrible as gold on the brow of an emperor. Its saints sang Alleluia, a song that is triumphant. Its form no man could discern. Its hues were ever changing. All the colors of the world were shining on that vessel. If the jewels of the mass chalice were living, to these its hues were comparable. This was the ship that conveyed the great treasure, the principal divine mystery, a relic of paradise. By a single leaf the nature of the tree may be judged. If the casket be difficult to describe, how much more the jewel? The names of the treasure are infinite in number. It is reflected in the eye. It is hidden in the flower. All men seek for it in all regions of the world. Many have gone astray, descending to the depths of hell. Hence it is that the instructed call this treasure heaven. Rightly indeed, Ambrose proceeds, is the treasure of the coracle given this high and final title. I need not say, of course, that the verses from the Red Book of Llancarvan have been interpreted in various senses by the few who have seen them. My father had the manuscript transcribed and 25 copies of the book printed. Some of these he sent to his correspondents, but I believe that on the whole he was disappointed with the letters he received. The most enthusiastic comment came from a German scholar, the successor of Zeus, who was deeply interested, but purely in the philological forms of the text. Of the home authorities, one interprets the treasure as the ovium character, or, in a wide sense, the art of literature. Another says that, in his opinion, the discovery of the use of metals is hinted at. And a third writes, it is clearly one of the many missionary legends which occupy so large a place in Celtic literature generally. It has great affinities with the Graal legend, which was, no doubt, originally a picturesque account of the Christianization of Britain. And so forth and so forth. But how wonderful these verses are! Not in their expression, which seems to me very much below the standard of the best Welsh poetry, but in their apprehension of a profound mystery. Of course, in comparing them with the mythos in its prose form, which is more generally known, it must be remembered that the Isle of Britain in Celtum has much the same significance and symbolism as Israel bears in Jewry. The material island has been transmuted and glorified, unconsciously perhaps in some cases, till it and its mountains and rivers, its hills and havens and cities, are as sacred and as mystic in their sense as Sim and Sean and Jordan are in another terminology. So the statement in one of the Cadwallader poems that Saxons shall be eradicated and bards shall flourish could be equated by the Philistines shall perish and the sons of Judah shall rejoice. This general consideration is necessary to the understanding of the particular legend, or rather myth, of Elfine, the coracle and the treasure. It is rightly, indeed, called heaven, for it is heaven manifested, a relic of paradise, a flower from the old garden. How truly astonishing it is to meditate on this great mystery, or rather on this sovereign and especial revelation and manifestation of the mysteries. The real truth is so infinitely greater than the truth as it is imagined to exist by the followers of the supreme vanity called occult science. These people, as I have noted elsewhere, are in reality caught in the folds of the thick veil of multitudinous illusions. But I am thinking now of their conception of what the truth is. They think of it as one may think, and rightly, of the higher mathematics, Chinese, or astronomy, as an abstruse and difficult study, success in which is to be attained by much intellectual effort, by the acquisition of many formulae, the receipt of much careful and expert instruction. To this vast error they add another. They believe that the lore they desire has been kept secret by certain bodies in certain hidden sanctuaries, in the same fashion, by similar machinery and methods as were used by the great craft guilds of the Middle Ages to preserve their trade secrets. Not in such wise is the treasure of the coracle to be attained. How marvelous, to those who understand, is the thought of this great gift, not enclosed in the custody of any secret body, but lying open to the whole world, one may almost say, touched and tasted, seen and handled by every man, the theme of constant conversation, of books, of pictures. No country or region is devoid of its presence. It is the subject of songs both good and bad. It has been built in stone and marble. It haunts the closes of music. And yet so great is the mystery, not one in 1,000, even of those who have treated it worthily, have the remotest thought of what it truly is. It is everywhere known and everywhere unknown, by everyone praised, by everyone despised. Those who would robe it in most splendid garments, strip it naked. Those who believe that they are the most devout of all worshippers scream hideous blasphemies. These things are of the nature of paradox, but the wisdom is a paradox in the earthly language, and its gifts are received incongruously, if one may say so. It may well be that a man has learnt the mystery of the stars by speaking a single word, if Dante knew anything of this matter. So great is the mystery, yet we can imagine that a black pygmy, or some such savage, might think of a cathedral as solid when he first saw it. He might perhaps think its height very wonderful, its pinnacles and spires strange fantastic rocks. The windows would appear masses of glittering crystals, disposed in curious tracings and patterns. The organ and the choir might well be deemed an odd effect made by the wind blowing through such an intricate forest of jagged stones. The gargoyles and statues would pass very well for freaks of nature. There are just such queer things in sticks and stones and vegetables in every museum. But he would have no notion of the existence of the inside of the cathedral, the pillars and the arches, the glory of the painted glass, the depths of the crypt, the splendors of the vaulting, the veil of the rood, the laver of regeneration, the burning torches, the fuming incense, the singing priests, the altar, and the sacrifice. How can he so much as dream of these things, gazing, as he thinks, on an odd stone mountain? All the whole world gazes at the cathedral. Few, indeed, have any notion that it is a cathedral, that it has a within as well as a without, and that it is the shrine of a great mystery. It is set on the mountain of the world, and cannot be hid. By how few can it be discerned? Nay, some even have entered, and have found nothing but mumbo-jumbo magic being done in the sanctuary, their eyes being dim and bleary. What would a thirsty costermonger on a bank holiday make of a magnum of Lafitte, the juice of a great year? He would know that it was wet. His thirst would be satisfied after a sort, but he would spit, very likely, and pull a wry face, and call for a pot of the foulest ale, to take the taste away. How many myriads of children have looked at and handled, and trodden and gathered and flung away, how many myriads of daisies, since there have been children and daisies on the earth. How many of these children have understood the nature and being of a daisy, according to the laws of botanical science. So great is the mystery. Everywhere is the treasure present. Everywhere it is visible. Scarcely at all is it known. and for its high elect servants it holds most intolerable unconjectured mysteries and sacraments, and so they who know most know also how poor and slight their comprehension is. They who serve the flame, and they alone, understand how unsearchable are its inmost depths. Here Ambrose's disquisition ends, and after several blank pages in the book, there is a strange matter concerning a valley at night. It would seem that the old man being busy with his odd tasks, the two cousins had wandered forth, had crossed the marshy land, and entered a hidden valley on a warm, still night, when the roses of the sunset seemed to linger in the western sky, and the air was so hushed that not a leaf stirred on the poplar or on the aspen tree. They sat in the valley by a little rippling stream, breathing the solemn air of the approaching night, made aromatic by the growth of sweet-scented ferns, by the subtle odor of the meadow-sweet, and very slowly the darkness gathered about the boughs of the twisted oak, about the fairy drooping of the ash, about the feathery spray of the birch. The olive-colored willow leaves became gray as they dripped down to the little torrent that poured beneath them. The glimmer vanished from the beech, and the old yew in the middle of the brake darkened into a black mound, funereal, melancholy. But the thorn-tree of the narrow crooked stem and the spreading growth of leaves stood out clear against the skyline, on the summit of the wall of turf that shut in that hidden valley. The air was growing dimmer, but the faintest rosy light now hung like a veil above the dark ridge of the mountain. But on this night the light never faded, for now the great full moon swam upward from the thin drifts of cloud and glowed over the hill. At first there was a great circle of dull red, glorious but without radiance, and as it mounted higher it shone with a rich splendor, mingling with the last afterglow and enchanting the earth utterly. Before their eyes the world was changed, and all the forms of things were imbued with a new and magical significance. This was now no valley in Gwent, no petty glen among the hills and woods that lay near the Werne. Into some strange country it had been instantly transmuted in the of God. Nay, it was not wholly new, for in dreams they had visited it, and in desires and in ineffable longings that could not be uttered, in waking visions some glamorous shadow of it had transiently appeared. There were depths and heights, dark shadows and isles of light, that each of them had seen with half-closed eyes when they were children, and that great tree that spread out its boughs like a fan on the summit of the hill had its double in old memories. A little while ago, but a few moments since, there had been a break before them. Now there was the image of a gigantic ancient wood, a grave of mysteries and of hauntings, whose boughs gave oracles, in whose black depths lurked all the awe and terror of the unknown. Vidis ut faunos lateat in silva, ibi saltat et cantat chorus nympharum aeternus. In dreams, too, they had been astonished by the high walls of earth that surged steep about them, by the wizard trees that were of no common growth, by the wild light that poured in a flood upon the valley, by the hushed silence broken by the faint ripple of the tiny stream. Ambrose began in a low voice to utter the great invocation, and as he spoke, something of horror passed away and peace returned to the valley. It is believed that in this place they told each other all their thoughts and all their love, and made their vows either to other unto life's end. Ambrose spoke of the anguish of the penance that was upon him, that for his sin he must forbear that which he had used so ill, that for them there only remained, if she was willing, the marriage of the cup. And notwithstanding his aversion from the methods of occultism, it is probable, for various reasons, that he has used on this point a certain reticence and reserve, considering apparently that not everything is to be spoken. Hence it is not easy to say what exactly is intimated by the phrase the marriage of the cup. It is natural, of course, to suppose that some reference is intended to the famous cup of Tylosant, which his father had shown him when he was a little boy, and as a matter of fact, there are some notes of a pilgrimage made by Sylvia and himself to Craddock's farm, where they undoubtedly saw the holy vessel. It seems to have been on this occasion that Craddock, now a very old man, told Ambrose of the destiny of the chalice on the failure of the line of hereditary keepers, and the charge was given and accepted, which led to Ambrose's happy and glorious end, and passing out of this life into the pleasures of paradise. Furthermore, it is certain that with the approval of Mr. Vaughan, Sylvia and Ambrose spent a week at Montes, Craddock's farm, and that after a rigorous fast and the recitation of a solemn and ancient ritual, they watched before the cup for a day and a night. Greater than all my recollection and all my dreams, writes Ambrose, were the glories and splendors of this marvelous and holy work. Again I saw with clearer eyes, with more piercing vision, the endless wanderings and turnings of the spirit in the maze of its journey. Again it seemed impossible that such a majesty could be the work of mortal hands. For a second time my soul was wrapped into the ways of light. I entered that ringing wood of gold and silver and bronze, and heard the perpetual entertainment of the 3 fairy birds of Rhiannon. I saw the seashore of the savage rocks by the realm of the wastelands, and the foam was driven in torrents on the rocks by a great roaring wind. And then again I saw the white light burst from the walls of the awful sanctuary of Cor-arbennic, where all the hallows and treasures of the island of Britain are preserved. I know not how long my spirit dwelt there in the glorious place of the perpetual choir, while there were communicated the words that cannot be uttered, the mystery of mysteries, from age unto ages. One body, one spirit, beholds the secret glory. Here, it will be observed, there is no reference to his companion, unless, perhaps, the last sentence may contain some esoteric meaning, which it is not possible to specify further. There is something to be said for this view. One may note, by the way, the grammatical inaccuracy of beholds, where behold is evidently required. But the absence of any explanation of the phrase in Ambrose's notebook must render the whole question a matter of doubt and uncertainty. The tale told afterwards by David Williams, the shepherd on the mountain, must be taken for what it is worth. It is possibly an instance of the faculty of the marvelous, still surviving in an out-of-the-way district. Or, and this is more likely, it is a distorted account of a perfectly natural incident. It must be noted, however, that Williams had a sort of faded reputation as a seer among the inhabitants of the lonely mountain farms, or, in the words of a gentleman connected with the Psychical Research Society, he was highly susceptible to the influence of impressions of a hallucinatory character. It should be premised that the man in question had seen Ambrose and Sylvia walking together once or twice soon after their arrival at Montes. Ambrose, he said, talked to him for some time on one occasion, and in confirmation of this, it may be mentioned that there is a brief sentence in the notebook about a strange-looking old shepherd with visionary blue-gray eyes. I spoke to him, but he seemed stupid enough. His hands were gnarled and twisted, with rheumatism or gout, I suppose, and looked like the knotted roots of a tree. Williams then asserts that on a certain Sunday morning he was keeping a sharp lookout after the sheep under his charge. Several of the flock had been missed during the summer, and David Williams had made up his mind that they had been stolen, and that the thief was a man named Lewis, a collier from Pont Nouweneth, near Pontepal. Williams had seen, or thought he had seen, Lois, as he called them, prowling about the mountain in a suspicious manner more than once, and he hinted, being well enough pleased with his occult reputation, that he had seen Lois with a sheep over his shoulder in a pewter dish, which served for a magic crystal in his cottage. An interesting case of autosuggested hallucination, according to the psychical researcher. However, having come to the conclusion that Sunday would be a likely day for the felonious collier's operations, he went into hiding in a brake not far from Montes. Well concealed by the thick undergrowth of hazel and maple, he was able to sweep the mountainside above him, and he could see the track by which the sheep-stealer would probably approach. It was a bright and sunny morning. The sky was deep blue, and here and there little delicate clouds, fleecy white, floated across it. The breeze blew up from the sea, and tossing woods lightened and darkened before it. One could see the waves of the wind as if it were reflected in the cornfields. And the hills and valleys of Gwent, its rivers and streams, its hanging woods, its white farm walls, were all glittering in the happy peace of the pure sunlight. In his hiding place among the hazel boughs, the shepherd said that the sound of all the bells of all the world came upon him. St. Michael by Torvine, St. Frechva on the hill were chiming. He heard St. Cadoc ringing in Caramane, and there were faint individual notes of single bells from little churches by the Soar. The bells made, he said, music and melody to charm the heart. He kept his eyes intently fixed on the wall of mountain that rose up above him. He could see his sheep feeding by twos and threes in the islands of turf among the tall bracken. It would not be difficult for a man to hide deep in the fern, and wait till a sheep grazed within reach, and then to catch hold of the nearest leg and draw the prey into shelter. The wind tossed the bracken to and fro. A brief struggle would not be noticeable, and the thief might crawl off under shelter for a considerable distance. Williams tried to keep one eye on the flock and the other on the path from the north, whence he thought Lois would approach, unless he were already safely hidden under the shaking green fronds, just waiting for his opportunity. A little to the left of his line of vision, on the verge between a broken field and the wild mountainside, there was a well shaded by a great thorn tree, which the old people used to call St. Tylo's Well. The water was supposed to be good for the cure of certain sicknesses. It was not more than 100 yards from Craddock's farm, Montes. Williams could not quite say what first attracted his attention to the well. He had a feeling, as he said, that a bright light was shining there, as if the sun were glittering on glass. He did not want to look. He was afraid that his attention might be distracted at the crucial moment. There were several sheep grazing quite close to the wall of fern, but he could not keep his eyes fixed. There was all the time that sensation as of a fountain of white light rising from the well. So at last he turned his head, that he might be satisfied that there was nothing to look at. Then, he said, something seemed to shoot all over him. His sensations, as he described them, were similar to those of an electric shock, and he saw a figure standing by the well under the thorn tree. Later on, when he told the story a good many times and had been questioned about it, he indulged in an elaborate and detailed account of this figure, the details being, evidently, more or less picturesque afterthoughts. But in his first tale, he confessed that he could not say anything very particular about this shape by the well. He would not, for instance, undertake to swear that it was a man, though he thought it was a man, but not somehow dressed as a man is dressed, not nowadays, whatever. The light, if there had been any light at all, had vanished. There was only someone there, and William said that sheep or no sheep, he felt he must go and see who it was. He did not know why, but so it was with him. So he came out of the thicket and began to run towards the well as fast as he could. And then, as his luck would have it, his foot was caught, and he fell full length. It was a minute, perhaps, before he could get up and free himself from the entanglement of the brambles, and it may be that he was a little dazed by the shock of the fall. But to his amazement, the figure that he had seen was no longer by the well under the thorn. Instead, the two young people staying at Montes were walking towards him. They smiled and nodded as they passed him, standing all astonished and confused, like a man roused suddenly from some strange and bewildering dream. This, and nothing more, was the story told by David Williams before he had introduced the element of imagination. It is not worthwhile detailing the later elaborations of the shepherd's fancy. It is probable, for instance, that his description of what happened when he looked round and saw the figure is but an amplification of the first simple statement as to the shock or shudder that passed through him. As has been said, the original story may be due to the faculty of the marvelous, or it may be a confused account of an ordinary incident. But there seems no reason to suppose that in this early version the shepherd did not at least intend to be veridical, and one or two circumstances in his tale, it is needless to specify them, will not be without interest to responsible and proficient students. It should be said that Ambrose, who of course heard of the story, declined to comment upon it in any sense whatever, and his manner made it impossible to press the question. His notebook contains no reference of any sort to the shepherd's statement. After his brief description of this second visit to the cup of Tylosant, some half-dozen pages are scattered over with odd words and phrases and incomplete tales which no doubt had their meaning and suggestion for the writer, but would be unintelligible to those who do not possess the key. For example, Arian-Hreget made a great feast on the day of Pentecost. It was of such splendor and richness, being constituted with all the most delicate meats of the earth, and the best wines of Greece and Gascony, and the entire world, being also graced with the art of song, and the presence of the most famous minstrels of the island of Britain, that it was known as the illustrious entertainment of Arian-Hreget. Arian sat on high on a platform thickly strewn with green rushes. His robe was of satin of the color of a red flame. He sat on a cushion of green satin. At the end of the banquet, Morgan the butler served a most precious and aromatic wine from some unknown region of the earth that was called wine of Pentecost. All who drank it praised its color, its flavor, and its odor, and were filled with a great joy. Then there came in a sorry little fellow, and craved speech with Arian. Forthwith it was granted, and he spoke. "King Arian," said he, "this entertainment is imperfect." "Tell me in what respect," said the king, thinking that the man was a jester. "With all my heart," said he, "it is because you have had no fit drink, and there can be no good feast without good drink, and you have not tasted the only drink that has been provided by the natural world." With that he drew from under his ragged cloak an old wooden bowl, which he had dipped in the stream as he came on his way to court. In the bowl there was some good water. There were also pebbles, some mud, a few weeds, a snail, and other impurities. "This," he said, "is the only true drink in the world, for who saw a beast that drank wine? Wine is, in fact, the liquor of dreamers and madmen." Arian and his guests laughed so heartily that the earth shook beneath the hall, and this speech concerning the wine and water is known as one of the 3 unreasonable sayings of the island of Britain. Again, Taliesin said that a song was still a song, even though the poet had never inscribed it in any characters, and it was declared that the inspiration in the soul of the bard was of greater reality than the trees of the wood, ovium characters. A bard uttered this sentence: "There is dark earth, there is a seed, there is germination, there is a root, there is a stem with leaves, there is a flower with concealed juices, there comes a bee, there is a golden honey, there is distilled mead in foaming horns, there is inspiration and unction in the spirit of the bard." This sentence was confirmed, and it was added that more than once inspiration had been given to poets who were fasting from meat and drink, and thus splendid and magnificent odes had been produced. The remaining notes and jottings are even more fragmentary and inconclusive, and it seems most likely that Ambrose used these remaining leaves as a kind of commonplace book. They may not refer in any way to his life at the Wern or to his relations with Sylvia Vaughan. It is certain that she was very dear to him, dearest of all indeed, and yet it was remarked that when, some 5 years later, she died very suddenly, she was apparently in perfect health, but was found one morning dead in her bed, he showed no signs of grief or even of shock. Indeed, if it had not been an impossible supposition, those who saw him soon after the news of Sylvia's death would have been inclined to think that he was endeavoring to suppress the signs of a joy and a delight that were almost unendurable in the intensity of their rapture. Strangely enough, certain papers of his seem almost to confirm this supposition, extravagant as it appears to be. They most certainly show no evidence of grief, nor even a passing depression. One sentence from these papers must be quoted here, by reason of the bearing it may have on the matters which have been just recorded. It is taken from a diary kept by Ambrose some 3 months after Sylvia's death. He was at the Wern, endeavoring to comfort her poor father, who was in the bitterest grief. In this diary, then, he writes under a certain date, "We wandered by the old paths, by the places of the old altars, by the well of the fishermen, by the hidden shrines, by the holy streams, by the valleys, and by hills now doubly hallowed by miracles which are past all utterance. We understood as never before the miracles of the secrets of the saints, of the secret glory which is hidden from the holy angels." It is difficult to believe that Mr. Vaughan is referred to in this passage. It would be more difficult still for anyone who had known Ambrose Merrick to believe him guilty of any species of occult quackery or mystification. Book 6, Chapter 1. There are various legends in existence as to Ambrose Merrick's famous last term at Lupton. As has been seen, Palmer, an honest man if a booby, was completely thunderstruck by the catastrophe. Indeed, he used to quote Horace's account of his conversion with reference to the manner of Ambrose's passing from the bonds and bounds of the dear old school. He, it is evident enough from the record that he has left of the affair, saw nothing and suspected nothing of what was to come. But naturally enough, others, quite as stupid as he, but less honest, were ready to affirm, after the event, that they had suspicions for some time that there was something wrong with the fellow. This, of course, is nonsense. The Luptonians, masters and boys alike, were no more capable of descrying the growth of a new life and a new joy and a new ecstasy in Ambrose than if they had been a kennel of Newfoundland puppies. You cannot drink Old Tom and 4-ale all your days, and then become at short notice, or at no notice, an expert in the finer growths of the Medoc. And if your mind is given up to rocker and sticker, the misunderstanding of the Latin and Greek literatures, and the doctor's sermons, you are not very likely to discern spiritual things or the presence of the hosts of the Lord. It was all nonsense. They saw nothing. Or if they saw that Merrick was looking very fit and pleased with himself, they thought it natural enough in view of his achievements and his prospects. The truthful, though idiotic, Palmer mentions in his account that Chesson had been rather annoyed with a certain essay sent in by Merrick. Perhaps even he rather exaggerates this incident in the light of after knowledge. The truth is that the head had given a kind of lecture to the 6th and had asked the boys to let him have by way of logical exercise an essay. The subject was at the choice of the writer, in which similar methods of argument should be used. Merrick sent him in, as he readily confessed, by far the best essay, only it was devoted, by the way, to a satirical refutation of the matter of the doctor's lecture. Original writing on any subject was not a strong point with the 6th at Lupton. The other boys had taken profuse notes of the lecture and had reproduced it with more or less success. This, as the doctor said, was not in the least what he had asked for, and he complimented Merrick on having been the only one in the form to see the point of the exercise. But, as he said, I must say that I am sorry for one thing. It is not that I gather from your essay that you do me the honor to disagree with me. Opinions are matters of very little consequence, so long as they are not held with any spirit of conviction. Never be bitterly certain about anything. You will only make yourself ridiculous. But what I want to say is this. If you want to get on in life, if you like it better, I will say, if you want to employ for the advantage of your fellow men the talents that have been given you by God, if you want to use your life, remember one thing. Renounce irony. Now the whole of this ludus of yours is permeated by irony. In a thing like this, it doesn't matter. It goes no farther than my desk. But when you once come before the world, a false step may be fatal. You may take it from me that the precipice of irony is of all the most fatal and final. Go over that, and you are smashed once and for all. You see, Merrick, I am talking to you as one reasonable being to another. You have read a good deal. Just think of a few great satirists of literature, and of what happened to them. Dryden could not keep out William of Orange, or Shadwell, or Nahum Tate. Rabelais just escaped the bonfire. Swift's Tale of a Tub is a wonderful piece of satire. You know what Swift's end was like. Above all, think of Swift. I dare say you've read Thackeray on Swift. You may be as satirical as you please if you follow Thackeray's methods, not those of the man he disliked so heartily. So long as you give the world sugar plums, you may add a slightly acid coating. People like it. You see, the other course is so entirely futile. You are smashed, as I say. Suppose you reply that you don't care, that you are willing to be martyred for a good cause. But the point is that the good cause is ruined with you, and very often because of you. You must see yourself that your case is bound to suffer if you begin your speech by letting the jury know that you consider them a pack of fools. Just think it over, Merrick, will you? The lecture on which the essays were to be written was a brief analysis of superstition and superstitious beliefs. Chesson had run through the various arguments by which, as he said, the superstitiously inclined generally defend foolish beliefs and more foolish practices. He pointed out that there was the appeal to universal or very general usage, to great names as sanctioning absurd practice and dogma, to results supposed to have been achieved, imaginary cures, for example, to antiquity, to a strong feeling of necessity, etc., etc. Then he showed how profoundly irrational most superstitions were. There was usually no connection between the supposed cause and the supposed effect. And he drew the attention of the boys to the fact that when the outworks of a system of thought were confessedly ridiculous, there was no reason to suspect that the central dogmas were in the same case, since the one derives from the other. Thus, he said, from the manifest folly and immorality of many of the Catholic miracles, so called, we may legitimately enough draw conclusions far from favorable to the whole Catholic system. In the same way, if you saw a man dancing naked in the street, you would not be very likely to ask his advice on any serious question. Absurdity in externals, in lesser things, probably proceeds from absurdity or madness in great things. The doctor showed, too, that the superstitious habit flourished chiefly amongst ignorant, backward peoples, whose minds were kin to those of children. This, he said, is a weighty argument. If we find a doctrine or a practice commending itself readily enough to immature ages of life, to children, to ages of immature thought, to the Middle Ages, to immature peoples, generally such as Spaniards and southern Italian peasants, while at the same time the doctrine or practice in question would be laughed at by 9 scientific men out of 10, then you are probably right in thinking such a doctrine or practice absurd. The lecture ended by showing that we should at least suspect every system which did not lead to some material benefit. We are more or less children of matter. We have been placed on this material sphere under material conditions. We are justified, then, in demanding that any doctrine proffered for our acceptance shall justify itself materially. If it cannot do this, we have reason to conclude that it is somehow or other out of harmony with the scheme of things to which we belong, that is, that it is false. Compare the state of superstitious savages with the state of Christian England from this point of view. Excluding all higher considerations, the savage as a whole fails materially. He is uncomfortable, while the Englishman is comfortable. Again, compare, still from the same point of view, the condition of an enlightened Protestant operative in some great industrial centre, say in Lupton, with the condition of a superstitious Irish peasant on his bog farm. The same result is given. The English Protestant is much more comfortable than the Irish Roman Catholic. Take a third instance. Think of what a country, a city, a house were like 500 or 600 years ago, and then think of the enormous improvements that have been effected: rapidity and security of transit, creation of sanitation, vast improvement in lighting, etc., etc. For the third time, our method gives the expected result. The modern, free from superstition, is in every way more prosperous materially than his superstitious ancestor who lived before the Reformation. Note the cumulative force of the instances. In each case, superstition is allied with poverty and discomfort, just as a particular microbe produces a particular disease. Ambrose sent in an essay on the folly of eating and drinking. He showed that, in the first place, it was absurd to defend these ridiculous practices because they were the custom of all, of universal usage. It had once been the universal usage, in civilized states at all events, to hear Mass. It had been the universal usage to believe in witchcraft and omens. Secondly, it was idle to quote the names of great authorities in praise of meat and drink, since great authorities could be cited in favor of the most absurd and the most monstrous beliefs and practices. Then, why allege the apparent benefit received through these insane orgies? There were people even at the present day who were ready to testify to the benefit they had received through bathing in holy wells, through kissing the mouldering bones of a dead man, through uttering various irrational formulae called prayers. Once such testimony would have been well nigh universal. In neither case, either of the few moderns or of the many ancients, do we attach the slightest credibility to these reports of apparent benefit. The plea of antiquity was, of course, out of court. It had been advanced in favor of every abuse, of every rank absurdity. If it had been listened to, we should still be in the condition of the Australian blackfellows. It was quite true that men had been eating and drinking for countless ages. They had been committing many other disgusting, irrational, criminal, useless, and offensive actions for countless ages. So far as the argument from antiquity was of any force at all, it was an argument establishing a high degree of probability against the utility of roast beef and beer, walnuts and water. Astrology was as ancient a practice as any of which we have record. Its antiquity is presumption of its absurdity. Then people would say that they felt they must have something to eat and drink. A Chinaman would tell exactly the same story of his opium pipe, an alcoholic maniac of his wine, a habitual smoker of his tobacco. Each of these deluded persons would pretend that he could not live without his stimulant or his narcotic, and would probably suffer severely, for a time, if it were denied him. The vicious craving induced by the habit co-operating with the imagination, so that a very real state of misery would be induced. Yet neither opium, wine, nor tobacco is generally accounted a necessary of life. If we admit the plea of "we feel that we must have it," then hypodermic injections of morphia will take their place amongst the simple necessaries of existence. Of course, if the drug maniac is guarded and the drug withheld, he will generally, in the process of time, be cured of his longing, and it is only reasonable to conclude that such would be the experience of the poor slaves of beef and beer, or bread and water. In some cases, the victim of drugs or alcohol turns out to be incurable. Even then, we do not draw the inference that opium and whiskey are necessary to life. Again, there was the supreme mark of irrationality about the processes of eating and drinking. People said they experienced certain sensations which they called by the arbitrary and conventional names of hunger and thirst. They could give no clear account of these supposed sensations, doubtless because they were entirely imaginary, the results of autosuggestion. If you cross-examined one of the sufferers from that acute form of food mania known as starvation, you would probably be astonished at the vagueness of the man's replies. He would, in all likelihood, be totally unable to give any intelligible account whatever of his supposed symptoms. You might get a sort of sinking feeling, or a sort of gnawing feeling, or a sort of all-overish feeling, or some such unscientific gibberish, coupled, very likely, with an unmeaning gesture in the direction of the abdomen. The average hysterical patient could, in 9 cases out of 10, describe her feelings with infinitely more detail and distinctness. And yet nobody in his senses believes that these hysterical sensations or disabilities have any existence out of the diseased brain of the sufferer. The strength of the hunger illusion is conceded. It is not so great, however, as the strength of the hysteria illusion, which may, in some cases, confine a healthy woman to her bed for 20 years. The sufferer from starvation thinks he wants food. The sufferer from hysteria thinks that she has paralysis. The one delusion is as reasonable as the other. But supposing that, out of mistaken kindness, you gratify the horrible and ridiculous longings of the hunger maniac. You give him, say, a steak, that is, a portion of the flesh of the ox. He divides this into portions, masticates it with his teeth, and lets it slip down his throat. He will then tell you that his craving is appeased, that he feels better, and a look of contentment may come into his face, not at all unlike the expression of stupid beatitude which may be seen on the face of the drunkard when his craving has been satisfied. Appeal to the patient, and ask him as a reasonable man to tell you how the swallowing of ox-flesh, partially burned, can lead to content or happiness. He will not tell you. He cannot, nor can anyone else. It is true that medical men, who have their formulas just as priests have their creeds, have written many unintelligible volumes concerning nutrition, assimilation, gastric juice, peptones, proteids, etc., etc. Note again the resemblance between the jargon of medicine and the jargon of theology. But it is not, it is presumed, seriously contended that the average starving man has read these volumes and has been convinced by their arguments that he has mastered in all its detail the intricate and wonderful processes by which somehow or other, confrere, the theological mystery, burned ox-flesh is converted into happiness and content, and high thoughts of joy. It is certain that the sufferer from starvation has done nothing of the kind. He is no more able to demonstrate the irrational action he has performed than a poor Catholic is able to demonstrate the sacrifice of the Mass. The starving man who chews beef, the devout man who goes to Mass, are, in plain language, persons who perform actions for which they are unable to give the semblance of a reasonable account. They are in the same class as lunatics, drunkards, and morphomaniacs. Probably it would not be difficult to trace this extraordinary delusion to its origin. At some very early and barbarous period in human history, eating was probably invented as a kind of initiatory rite. It was supposed that he who received the flesh of the ox into his body partook mystically of the ox's strength and endurance. Different animals were added to obtain different qualities, the whole process being no doubt a curious ritual, which it might not be impossible to reconstruct. The same theory pervaded medicine for many ages, and is perhaps not quite extinct even at the present day, and even now some savages believe that to eat the heart of the lion gives courage. It is not difficult to understand that eating, originally a sacrament, became in course of time a habit, and then an apparently irresistible appetite. Ambrose then examined the question of the outworks, on which the doctor had laid a good deal of stress. He had not much difficulty in showing the extreme extravagance and absurdity of all the ceremonial of eating and drinking. It is contended, he wrote, that eating and drinking are customs intimately, nay, most intimately, connected with the body's health, with its very existence. If this were really so, one cannot think that men would have surrounded these actions with a grotesque and elaborate social ritual. A man does not gather his friends round him when he has to undergo a serious operation. He does not send out cards when he intends to take a dose of medicine. It is not even customary to make the bathroom a social center. If eating and drinking be, as it is urged, of vital consequence to bodily health and existence, then they are the intimate concerns of the body, and every consideration of decency demands that such matters be attended to in strict privacy. We have seen that in reality a dinner party is an irrational relic of a forgotten rite, a true superstition, in fact, and on this hypothesis the crazy ceremonial practiced on such an occasion becomes comparatively intelligible. Otherwise, such a function would have no counterpart out of Bedlam, and few within it. Further, let us consider what eating at the present day really implies. No man will pretend that mustard and horseradish are necessary to life. No man can maintain that dishes are rendered more wholesome or nourishing by the addition of elaborate sauces and condiments, or that a jelly sustains and fortifies any the more by being made in an extravagant shape and colored with some bright pigment. If food were taken as a necessary, probably 5 minutes would be sufficient for its consumption. It would be prepared in some soluble and digestible form, and would be swallowed by the bedside, the first thing in the morning and the last thing at night. It would certainly not be served to people dressed in silly costume by ministrants in a sillier. It would not be disguised in all imaginable shapes and colors, concealed by strange flavorings on a board richly draped, decorated like an altar with lights and flowers, while in some cases music is played on a band of instruments. Note how all these circumstances fit in with the theory of a savage rite of initiation. The outworks, then, of eating and drinking are positively maniacal in their irrationality. We may safely conclude, therefore, that the whole system is profoundly unreasonable, absurd, and unjustifiable. It was clear, he showed, that eating and drinking made their chief appeal to barbarous and backward peoples and ages. Children were gluttons. Savages were voracious eaters. In the Middle Ages, people devoured terrible gargantuan banquets, and uncultured and unscientific people in all parts of the world could scarcely think of a festival of any kind without thinking also of enormous meals, washed down by enormous draughts of liquor. In fact, a feast had come to be synonymous with the act of eating and drinking to gross excess. Scientific men were agreed in denouncing such orgies as barbarous and highly injurious to health. Another of the doctor's tests was therefore satisfied. The food habit was indulged in to the fullest extent by the ignorant and childish, and condemned by men of science. Ambrose's case was easiest when he came to the great point of material advantage. As it happened, a term or two before, some tainted meat had been supplied to one of the houses. 2 boys had died, and a considerable number were seriously ill. It was a bad case of ptomaine poisoning. He took this as an example, near at hand, of the horrible dangers of eating and drinking. He worked from this text to the whole question of impurities in food and drink, and showed the high probability that death might lurk literally in every mouthful and in every draught. He made an elaborate list of the hideous and mortal diseases that might be, nay, that were, communicated to the victim of the hunger and thirst mania. Meat of all kinds swarmed with germs of disease. It was killed and stored under the most filthy and dangerous conditions. In its preserved forms, it was usually rotten with gangrene and decay before it was made into the sausage or placed in the tin. He quoted a well-known doctor to the effect that the killing and preparation of meat had made no advance in the direction of sanitation since the Stone Age. He reveled in the description of rotten pork and tuberculous beef. To drink liquor of any kind was, of course, a mere courting of death. There were statistics showing how many thousands of children were carried off annually by milk alone, reckoned by the ignorant and superstitious as the most innocent of fluids. He made, in fact, a little monograph of poisonous adulterations of food and drink, with notes culled from the papers of whole families who had fallen victims to the food and drink habit. Then, of course, there was the larger point of view. It was not difficult to show from various medical authorities that, adulteration apart, the whole matter of diet and drink was in itself highly noxious and prejudicial to health. One great ban, for example, pronounced all the alcohols to be poisons, pure and simple, of varying degrees of venom. One might achieve a death of rapid and horrible torture on brandy or gin, or one might choose to linger inefficient and ill for many years, while strength and vitality were sapped by small beer. But he demonstrated that it was of all futilities the most futile to suppose that safety was to be sought in temperance beverages. The vegetarians were able to show the horrible and destructive effects of meat-eating clearly enough. Their case was proven up to the hilt. The carnivorous man was an unhealthy man, a feeble man, and also a moral monster. But, on the other hand, the meat-eater could show quite as clearly that the rice-eating Bengalis were a weak-kneed race of chatterers, capable only of showing energy in the perpetration of horrible and fiendish cruelties on defenseless women and children. In fact, it was only too plain that the wickedest actions in the world had been committed by vegetarians. So with drink. Alcohol was deadly, it was true, but there were eminent authorities who declared that tea and coffee were much more deadly, that the continued consumption of these beverages could only lead to the utter ruin of the race in body and mind. As for water, its use had swept away armies and desolated cities. The conclusion was irresistible. So far from the food delusion being a material benefit, it was clearly responsible for more violent and agonizing deaths than all the wars that had been ever waged. It was a more frightful revenge than the yellow hag, the black pest, the plague, the sleeping sickness, and Asiatic cholera, and a more enlightened age would doubtless treat its victims as criminal lunatics. Chapter 2. Ambrose was a good deal amused when he heard of the horror with which his Rabelaisian epistle had been received. He was a little sorry, too, as well as amused. He had forgotten the utter ignorance of literature which characterizes the average schoolmaster, the absolute inability to understand the literary point of view. Ambrose had meant to send his old housemaster an entertaining ludus, in the doctor's phrase, but what Mr. Horbury had received was, to him, a terrible compound of blasphemy against the school ideals and obscenity. It was a pity, but Ambrose Merrick could never quite understand things. He would have reverenced the high abstraction of the saint, his unwillingness to be disturbed in his vision of great joy by the dust and dirt of earth. He could have appreciated the frame of mind which would turn away from a report of the debates in the House of Commons as an obscene nuisance. But he could not see the average point of view. He always protested that the man who gloated over the scabrous and hideous matter in the daily press, over details which were unspeakably degrading and repulsive, and then subscribed for the suppression of Rabelais and Boccaccio, was nothing more or less than a hypocritical scoundrel, whose escape from utter damnation might perhaps be effected by the power of the eternal compassions, but in no other way. "Look," he said once, "here, in this highly respectable family journal, there is a careful and elaborate account of the career of a hermaphrodite. See, one is not spared the details. How the dear public will revel over it. How they will smack their lips. The men who sent poor old Visitelli to prison for publishing La Terre in English. These men and their sons. But, of course, it is highly for the public interest that minute information about hermaphrodites should be circulated in the press, and journalists, as is well known, are the slaves of the public good. You know how zealously these gentlemen strive to protect the young girl from the contamination of reading licentious literature. It is interesting to see the literary fare which they consider suitable for their innocent young protégée, the girl of the future, carefully instructed in West End scandals, divorce proceedings, and hermaphrodites, will be truly a charming product." Ambrose could never understand, and so he was astonished at the horror which his little jeu d'esprit excited. He has left few notes, and these of the slightest, with respect to his sojourn among the strolling players. It was an odd circumstance which made him think of the stage. A year or so before he left Lupton, the headmaster had conceived the brilliant idea of inviting a company of actors to give a performance of Henry V in the Speech House. The upper forms were studying the play in some disgusting edition proceeding from the highest scholastic sources. Or rather, they were engaged in burying the poetry and the fun and the dramatic action under a load of rubbishy notes, the chief point of which seemed to be that you were to confrere everything with something else. At the same time, the period was being carefully got up, which meant that the boys were busy in digging the pit of their historical ignorance broader and deeper, and in surrounding the pit aforesaid with a gilt fence of names and dates. A few, perhaps, had glanced into the little books, and were inclined to think they must have been jolly times, that Harry of England was a sportsman, that it must have been fine to have broken a lance on Crispin Crispinian's day, that Nym and Pistol and Bardolph were almost as good fun as Jack Harkaway. In fact, that here was some rare high stuff, only it was a pity that the old bounder who wrote it couldn't have put it all into plain decent English that a fellow could read as easily as a novel. They were soon convinced of their error after their form masters had taken them in hand for a couple of weeks. The text was a series of elaborate traps and mines which the notes sprang upon them, traps and mines of dates and facts and names, historical, philological, grammatical traps, all of infinite tedium, all or nearly all leading up to confrere. This word was to be compared with the Gothic form, this with the Frisian, this with the Middle English. This phrase was paralleled with something not a bit like it from Euphues. Name of author, dates of birth and death, date of publication, all duly given. This sentence, with the remark of Bacon's, dates as before. Here the authority of Cotgrave was invoked. There the happy lads found themselves plunged into a consideration of Hooker's ecclesiastical polity. It did not take the masters long to reduce Harry into a disagreeable shadow, draped in dates. Bardolph, Nym, and Pistol became subjects for examination and nothing more. The battle of Agincourt was found out and declared to be a pest and a nuisance. They were all, one might say, permanently fortified against all knowledge or understanding of English history, literature, manners, poetry, and humor for all time, and some of them did very brilliantly in the inevitable examinations. It was in the midst of this agreeable, intelligent, and instructive process that the Hathaway Company paid their visit at the doctor's invitation. The boys welcomed them at the station. The player folk, poor souls, were wary. They had been doing a number of one-night stands at the end of their tour. For the last fortnight they had been worked to death. Their train calls had varied between the hours of 6 and 8. They had partaken of badly prepared and insufficient breakfasts by gaslight, and then had turned out into rainy, wind-swept streets to tramp down to the station, where they would find the stage carpenter, the baggage man, and the assistant stage manager, who had been getting the scenery on the trucks all night, and had enjoyed some 2 or 3 hours' sleep on the station benches. Then the railway journey, the arrival at some little town, or rather, very often, at some station a mile or so away from the town. They shouldered their baggage and tramped in the muddy road. It was 12 o'clock, perhaps. The matinee was at 2, and it was necessary to find rooms and get something to eat before going to the hall to dress and make up. It is not agreeable, pacing the streets of a strange town where actors are regarded as professional thieves in disguise, knocking at doors in vain, received here with grins of contempt, there with open violence, walking still and walking, finding that the inns and taverns are all mysteriously full, still walking, and wondering whether one will have to leave the question of rooms till the matinee is over. Then the hall, the dressing rooms, are usually the places for the display of inventive ingenuity, for there are sometimes no tables, and very often no chairs. The cautious stroller always carries his own glass in his basket or bag, or sack, as he prefers calling it. He does not mind standing on a damp stone floor in his bare feet, and drawing on his tights by cautious tugs, preserving his balance the while with long-acquired art. He may have to make up in a dark hole, first cousin to a cellar. He draws out his bit of candle, fixes it somewhere, and with hand-glass in one hand and grease-paint in the other, goes gravely to work. And if he be a good stroller, his make-up is well and carefully done, as if he were in a smart room in a West End theatre, with a dresser at his elbow and 2 movable electric standards on each side of his mirror. Then the show, on the best makeshift of a stage that the staff has been able to arrange. Sometimes it has had to be extended by boards laid on barrels. Sometimes entrances have to be made up a step-ladder, and exits are leaps into an apparent void. The footlights are a long series of holes pierced in a gas pipe, and a god from the machine has known what it is to have his deity illumined by the rays of a bicycle lamp. The show over, a villainously cooked chop or steak is enjoyed, and just as the stroller feels that he would like a doze of an hour or 2, it is time to go to the hall and repeat the performance of the afternoon. He gets to sleep somewhere between 12 and 1, and rests till 6 the next morning, and then begins a tomorrow that is the replica of yesterday. The Hathaway Company had enjoyed a fortnight of this routine before their arrival at Lupton. The low comedian, generally a merry fellow, had said gloomily in the morning that, personally, he would prefer a tour conducted by Red Indians, and the heavy man was bilious. His face was yellowish, and his eyes rolled in a threatening fashion. It was not safe to talk to him. They were all tired to death, and felt as if they had not slept for years when they got out at Lupton, after a train journey of some 4 hours. The boys were waiting for them. It was a whole holiday in honor of the event, and the head had relaxed the laws as to bounds. So some 200 of the impetuous lads were ready on the platform, and a shriek of delight and derision arose as the wretched strollers clambered warily out of their carriages. It was better fun than a travelling menagerie. The players fought their way out into the street amidst a torrent of jeers. The men were congratulated on their taste in dress, and indeed some of the poor fellows were shabby enough. One cannot afford to go to Conduit Street on 35 shillings a week for 42 weeks in the year. And one wit raised the shout, "First on the right, third on the left, shortest way to the county jail." But most of the fun was at the expense of the girls, who were certainly not looking their smartest and prettiest. One boy asked in a clear, cold voice, in accents that suggested a haughty patrician lineage, "Do you mean to tell me that anyone pays to see these women?" And there were shrieks of appreciation over Biederstein's ready wit. The boys followed the actors in groups right through the town. The wretched folk could not shake them off, and young Manners had the pluck to pull the back hair of one of the girls. He wanted to see if it was a wig, as he politely explained to the indignant lady. Another lad, more gallant, went up to two of the girls who were walking apart, and proposed an amorous rendezvous in the cricket pavilion. Altogether, Lupton that day was a monde en loose amuse. Ambrose heard of it all from the chief jesters. He agreed that it was good sport. The manager of the company complained to the head, who expressed his regret that anything unpleasant had occurred, and Mr. Horbury spoke to Ambrose about the incident. "Of course," he said, "we must disapprove of that kind of thing officially, and if they could have given us any of the fellows' names, they would have had to do lines. High spirits are all very well, but there's a limit to everything. At the same time, you know, I'm not altogether sorry. Boys are such young fools in many ways. There is such a lot of false glamour about the stage. There always is a glamour about the more elaborate forms of loafing. That, as I say, I'm not sorry some of our fellows have had a lesson as to how actors and acting are really regarded by decent Englishmen. I don't think that many Luptonians who are about today will want to go on the stage. Eh, Ambrose?" Mr. Horbury chuckled. He really thought that a useful lesson had been administered. Ambrose had remembered the incident, and when the time came, he made his way at once to the town in which the Hathaways were acting. He was quite clear that there must be a great deal of good in anything which aroused the contempt and derision of all Lupton. Chapter 3. I am afraid, Ambrose notes in one of his books, that the golden days of the stage are numbered. One sees more and more surely that the horrible wave of respectability is advancing on the profession, that the old race of workmen with their mysteries and craft receipts, their peculiar jargon, their pride in the art, is dying out. The new generation is nothing to me. An English country gentleman is an excellent type. I admire it with all my heart, but I don't care to see an indifferent imitation of the character being given by a strolling player. How odd it is that in Chaucer one does not see the faintest desire in the clerk of Oxford or the miller to be taken for the knight or the squire. I suppose that the new generation was knocking at the door when I joined Hathaway, but it had not been let in. We were not ashamed of our craft. We were proud of it, and accepted our blue chins as a miller accepts his flowery costume. What a good life it was, in spite of discomforts, of greasy food cooked by slap-cabbage landladies, in spite of rooms that were often very far from cleanliness, in spite of evil-smelling, inconvenient dressing-rooms in insanitary theaters, of wearisome journeys, of rehearsals that began sometimes at 11:30. After the show, we came very near to the ideal life which man was meant to lead. Who can measure the excellent effects of vagabondage, of the continual rolling which keeps the stone clean of moss and lichen? Acting is not a high art, nor a fine art. It is doubtful whether it is really an art at all, but the life of the strolling player is, or was, the nearest approach that this age can make to the life of the wandering craftsman of the Middle Ages. Sometimes I hear, by chance, snatches of old music, and I want to take off my hat. Back I go to the stuffy dressing-room, and the dear scattered faces are reassembled. The drums and trumpets sound from the stage. I am waiting to go on in the wings. The clanking of the armor and the clash of swords sounds in my ear. The stage manager, would he were here, hisses his opinion of my dancing with wonderful eloquence from the prompt corner. It all returns, dear happy life of players errant, purged unconsciously of most of the hideous vices of modern civilization. I take off my hat when I hear the old music, for I think of the old friends and the old days, of the theatre in the meadows by the sacred river, and the song of the nightingales on sweet spring nights. There is no doubt that we may safely hold with Plato his opinion, and safely may we believe that all earthly things are but broken copies and dim lineaments of everlasting realities. Therefore, I hope and trust I shall again be gathered into the true Hathaway company, quae sursum est, which is the purged and exalted image of the lower, which plays for ever a great mystery in the theatre of the meadows of Asphodel, which wanders by the happy streams and drinks from an eternal cup in a high and blissful and everlasting tavern. Ave cara sodalitas, ave semper. Ambrose stayed a little more than 2 years with the strollers. He sent the address of a solicitor to his uncle, his coming of age, and found when Mr. Horbury sent in his statements that there was a pleasant little sum of money to his credit. Mr. Vaughan consented to stay on at the Wern, and Ambrose, bidding farewell to his companions, sheathing his property sword for the last time, journeyed up to London on a cold, bright day in early spring. Chapter 4. He felt strangely enough as he saw the outer walls of London rising before him, and the train rushed through the suburbs and into the terminus. It was nearly 4 years since he and Nellie had paid the famous visit, and it seemed as if it were such a long while ago. Everything was so changed, within and without. And yet, though there was a keen March wind blowing, and white clouds were fleeting across a slate-blue sky, he almost felt again that hot blast that had welcomed them as they left the station. But it was all over. The curtain had been rung down forever on that scene of his life. The streets were changed. Perhaps, he thought, it was the difference between March and August. But no, it was not so. The London of 4 years ago no longer existed, for him at all events. A new man, he came to a new city. He settled down finally in a pleasant set of rooms in Gray's Inn Square. The windows of his sitting room looked out on the garden, and by the time he took up his residence the leaves were green, and he might have thought himself a dweller in a lodge in a wood if it had not been for the low rumble of traffic from Theobald's Road, which was only silenced in the deepest hours of the night. It was in this place that he sat down and began that long meditation which was henceforth his life. One of his first tasks, it is believed, was to set in order the notes he had made 4 years before in Little Russell Row for the Defence of Taverns, and soon afterwards he wrote his article on The Hidden Mystery, which attracted a certain amount of notice, for accidental rather than essential reasons. It appeared in the pages of a most respectable magazine, a magazine of classic fame which had settled the business of many a young poet far away back in the 30s and 40s. The editor was attracted by Ambrose's style, and as it afterwards appeared, could not have had any very clear understanding of the subject matter. The fact was, Ambrose had been artful. His essay was written on a curious text, the utter blindness of 2 centuries or more to the beauties of Gothic art. He showed how even the draftsmen of the 18th century, with, say, Lincoln Cathedral before their eyes, were utterly unable to draw it correctly, to give any true idea of the Gothic mouldings or tracery. He quoted Smollett on York Minster, Washington Irving on Westminster Abbey. He made a catena of witnesses to the singular fact that for more than 2 centuries men were surrounded by wonderful buildings which, in a true sense, they were absolutely unable to see. He showed, too, that, to a great extent, the same principle worked in literature and in painting. He quoted Dr. Johnson's dictum as to Pope's poetry, his criticism of Lycidas, pointing out the extreme shrewdness, sagacity, and honesty of Johnson's character, and yet the lexicographer thought Lycidas was something very near to rubbish, and Pope's admirably clever verse poetry in its most absolute, perfect, and final form. As for painting, were not the Carraccis highly esteemed, and Giotto, Cimabue, and Botticelli regarded as semi-barbarians? At the same time, he showed that it would never do to write off the 18th century as utterly deficient in all artistic perception, since in the rarest and purest of all the arts, it could boast of the greatest of masters. The age of Pergolesi, Handel, Bach, and a vast number of minor musicians who wrote work as charming in its way as the minor poets of the Elizabethan and Caroline periods. This was no age of artistic barbarism, and even in architecture itself, St. Mary le Strand was, of its kind, very near to perfection. But then, on the other hand, what was the attitude of the Augustins and their successors towards nature, scenery, the visible universe generally? Clearly, it was an attitude of men blinded, stupefied, befogged. The trees and streams of the great Berkeley, illustrious among philosophers, a spiritual thinker, if there ever was one, were taken out of Plato's dialogues. The poets went to Hampton Court Gardens and to the famous maze for nature. They called the wood a bosky shade, and Johnson and Boswell, who found Greenwich Park much too countrified for their taste, were interested in the wild Hebrides as one is interested in grotesque oddities from the South Sea Islands. And, to take another region of the soul, nearly all of these men, most of them acute and intelligent in a high degree, were firmly convinced that the blessings of the Reformation were so clear, palpable, and certain that there was no room for argument on the matter. Wharton, certainly, hinted that the effect on the arts was not of the best. Johnson, probably for sport, took the unpopular side in talking to Boswell. But in the general opinion of the cultured, the matter was as clearly settled as the result of adding 2 and 2. Popery was wholly wrong. Protestantism was entirely right. It seemed, then, to follow from all these instances that whole generations of men, no more stupid and ignorant than their ancestors or successors, might be absolutely blinded as to matters that were, literally and physically, before their eyes. There could hardly be more conspicuous objects than Lincoln Cathedral, a forest, or a mountain. Beauties could scarcely be more clearly evoked and displayed than the beauties of Lycidas. And many of the men thus blind on certain points were of very exceptional ability and acuteness on other matters, and even on artistic matters. It was as if a man walked through a wood, admiring the beauty of the oak, and at the same moment wondering why an all-wise Creator had made the grotesque ugliness of the ash and the beech and the yew. Therefore, Ambrose proceeded, since intelligent and thoughtful and sagacious men were obviously blind as to such obvious and manifest beauty as that displayed in visible nature, Gothic architecture, Elizabethan and Caroline poetry, and Catholic ritual. Is it not highly probable that men no less intelligent and sagacious are at the present moment blind as to certain matters which may not be so obvious, which, it should rather be said, seem to us not so obvious? Is it not possible that while we look down on the Augustins with pitying superiority, we ourselves may be sunken in darkness on matters infinitely more vital and important than the subjects on which they displayed so invincible an ignorance? This may be difficult to realize. To us, the beauty of Lincoln Cathedral, of Lycidas, of the great spectacle of the visible world, of early Italian art, is so clear and so incontestable that we could as readily contradict the axioms of Euclid or the laws of logic as the presence of beauty in these things. But, after all, qu'avons-nous? Unless we take up the position that we have attained to final perfection, that we have surpassed all the wisdom of the wise, all the art of all artists, all the visions of all seers, that compared with us all precedent humanity is in all things, as a schoolboy in the multiplication table to Sir Isaac Newton, that the universal goal is attained, the race run and won forever. Unless we take up this slightly ridiculous and monstrous position, we must confess that there is a high probability, at all events, that we, in our turn, are blind to many sights, deaf to many sounds, insensitive to many wonders, ignorant of many mysteries. Then Ambrose went on to show the probability of this thesis by many analogies, drawn from things of mind and of matter. He instanced the laws of logical science, latent in man's discourse from the beginning of speech, and yet not clearly perceived nor demonstrated till the day of Aristotle. Here was a mystery or magistry that had been visible and yet invisible for countless ages, that had been before the intellectual eye of countless myriads, day after day, hour after hour. The veriest savage who used stone arrows to shoot prehistoric game must have been familiar with Barbara and Celerin, and yet he knew it not, though he won his dinner and his life by this knowledge that was concealed from himself. The analogies were indeed innumerable. How many apples had fallen before the law of gravitation was enunciated? How often had the power of steam been perceived before the obvious application was disclosed? And man had gazed at the earth and sky, at the clouds and the woods, the sea and the rivers, for how many ages before the mystery and the beauty of the world were really manifested in the days of Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Turner. At this point, he paused for a while in his main argument to follow a curious byway of thought. How far, he asked, were we to suppose that much that was not expressed was still felt or experienced? Suppressed, perhaps, out of deference to convention or from fear of consequences. Here was an obscure point which seemed to invite an endless inquiry on which it was impossible to dogmatize. For instance, you might investigate the marriage customs of some tribe more or less primitive. You might satisfy yourself that to all intents and purposes, marriage and giving in marriage in the tribe in question were as prosaic, as much a matter of business as pig-dealing in Wiltshire. And yet, from the heart of this race of chatterers in women, there might surge up a burst of song that expressed all the passion of love. In a sense, the courtship of Portia by Bassanio was a squalid fortune hunt. Still, there were lines that spoke nobly of the latenza deitas. Perhaps there were many men of the 18th century who were thrilled to the heart by the ineffable mystery and beauty of the Gothic work, only they were ashamed to confess it, to write themselves down as lovers of ignorance and barbarism in art. And it was hardly conceivable that the heart of men had not been stained by the awe and wonder of the world till about 1790, the glory of dawn and sunset, the terror and splendor of mountains and seas, the delight of the woods in summer, the sweetness and the incantation of scented nights. These things could not have been wholly without witnesses. It could not have been permitted that so many thousands of years should pass before the hieroglyphic speech of the world to the soul was in a measure deciphered. No doubt there were hints of this universal mystery written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin, and still they were but hints, and undoubtedly the full expression, or rather the approximately full expression, had been reserved to a comparatively late date. And yet, how many people since the foundation of the world had felt all this, all that Coleridge and Wordsworth, Keats and Tennyson had written and had lacked words or courage to express it? He wondered how much of previous treasure we had lost, how much we were still losing from this lack of courage, from this fear of telling the great incredible dreams which apparently contradict sense and experience, science and convention, reason itself, and yet are perfect wisdom and beauty. It seemed probable enough that this loss had been, was, and would be huge enough. He noted the fierce, irrational intolerance that was ready to be called out at any moment by the slightest novelty, by the faintest departure from the most external of the conventions, more especially when the new departure moved towards truth and beauty. Alexander Pope and the people of his tribe had but little to fear, since the lower part of every man is always in sympathy with clever observations of common externals expressed in more or less clear and witty phrases, and above all with trite moralizings. As has been well said, Tate and Brady were in the longships that bore Hengist and Horsa, and it might have been said, with equal truth, that Tet and Bredy followed the Cymry to the Isle of Britain from the land of summer. In every age, in every race, there was a great majority ready and anxious to applaud such gems as the proper study of mankind is man. One craftsman hates another. The unexpected often happens, as genuine pearls of poetry and wisdom, and those who excelled in this manner need fear no terrors or persecutions. But when the turn of the wheel came, when a man saw the heavens opened, and it said so, then let him beware. For Professor Wilson, Mr. Lockhart, and Dr. McGinn were not slow to deal with such a one as this. It seemed probable, then, that human nature being what it is, and always has been, anxious in the main for an easy time in things of the body or things of the mind, averse from incurring opposition and dislike, desirous, in the popular phrase, to live and let live, it was probable that many who could have spoken, have kept silence, were still keeping silence. Poe had an interesting speculation as to the fate of transcendent greatness in vision. He thought that it had been rewarded for the most part by the scaffold and the madhouse, but this was doubtful. With contempt and neglect, and then with a spurious post-mortem fame, were the truer version of the facts. It was interesting to note, by the way, how in some cases there had been a kind of composition. Tennyson had no doubt compounded for the Fatima by the May Queen and Enoch Arden. The verities had been passed unchallenged under the cloak of the domesticities. In like manner, Poe, a great seer as well as a great artist, was accorded a sort of contemptuous toleration as the author of The Bells and the Raven. He returned after this digression to the central point of his argument, the probability of an all but universal ignorance or blindness as to things of the very highest moment. He suggested further that it was even probable that there might be one central truth, one eternal beauty, one great word, that had not been lost, at least in time, because it had never been found. A secret of secrets, a master mystery, a key opening the door of the shut palace of the king. Taking this as his hypothesis, he imagined this one truth as everywhere present, everywhere visible, everywhere known, and yet all unknown. It might perhaps be spoken of under the most varied symbolisms. It might be manifested under the most diverse forms. It might sometimes be so degraded in evil use as to appear more pertinent to devilry than divinity. Or again, it might be like some ingenious puzzle in its manifestation, as if one were to conceive, for example, some picture divided into minute portions, and these strewn at random on a table. It might be very difficult to perceive any relation between the parts. It might not appear that they were parts at all. It might be the work of a great imagination to collect the bright fragments together and set them in their true order, so that the great and beautiful whole should appear. Better still, he said, conceive a stained glass window taken to pieces, bit by bit from its leads, and the irregular red and green and blue and golden morsels put in a basket and given to a savage. It is likely enough that the black fellow would be delighted with the fragments as ornaments of a new kind, but how hard it would be for him to set the golden pieces together and make of them the saint's aureole. In all likelihood, most of the glass would find its way to the swamp, there to give greater worship to the fetish deity. He went on in this ingenious and elaborate vein, conjecturing the existence of this great master mystery, the mainspring and the source of all being, all joy, all savor, and all delight, the ens unum in diversis, that which gives glory to the dawn and a melody to concordant sounds, sweetness to the rose, magic to the poem, wonder to the romance, potent also and all prevailing in the highest secrets of life and death. The article appeared, as has been said, in a magazine of the highest respectability. It was a good deal noticed and commented on as a passionate and eloquent appeal for the appreciation of beauty in common things. It was only some year or two later, when Ambrose had published his first story, the Rosa Mundi, that people began to put two and two together, and it was generally felt that his work was not quite nice. It must not be imagined that the idea for which he worked was at all understood, but in certain instances there were I's in the article and dots in the story, and it would have been quite difficult not to put the one on the other. Such was the beginning of a long and austere career, devoted to a great and mystic end. Of course, Ambrose was misunderstood, often laughed at, occasionally abused, but he always maintained that his ways were made far too pleasant for him. He deplored the soft, indifferent age in which he labored, which could only provide a quarter column of ill-tempered chaff for the stones and fires of braver times. Indeed, the ill-temper and the chaff were often missing. His reviewers told him he was a clever fellow, and only asked, much more in sorrow than in anger, why he did not devote his talents to simple, healthy themes of domestic interest. It is not probable that the end will ever be clearly understood. The few documents that are available seem to leave the whole matter in a state of conjecture, and it has only been possible to surmise the objects of the last wonderful journey after a very careful and minute reading of Ambrose's notebooks and journals, in which certain hints and things half said seem to supply a certain clue to a strange adventure. So far as can be gathered, then, it appears probable that old Cradock, in handing over to Ambrose the blessed cup of Tylosant, had delivered also a certain charge concerning the relic, and it may well be that the final removal of the Sangreal in the romances owes its existence to traditions and rumors of the charge in question. However this may be, it is practically certain that Ambrose, when he went to the East, took with him the holy vessel, and bestowed it in safe custody in the place to which he had been directed, and perhaps its splendor and glories will never more be seen by mortal eyes. The Kurds crucified him on a tree that stands just without the village where he was staying. They descended on the Christian people, descended in their usual fashion. Some of these fled, some hid themselves, many were given to torture and cruel death. One of them, who was hidden, told how he saw the stranger Ambrosian brought out, and how they put before him the image of the crucified, that he might spit upon it and trample it under his feet. But he kissed the icon with great joy and penitence and devotion. So they bore him to the tree and nailed him there, and after he had hung some hours, the Kurds, enraged, as it was said, by the delight and rapture that shone on his face, killed him with their spears. In this manner did Ambrose Merrick gain red martyrdom, and achieve the most glorious quest and adventure of the Sangreal.